Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku received the all for one instead of the one for all, before going to the UA Academy, and became a hero, part 2. So before we start, please go check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description, also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. Heroics was the class taught by All Might after all. The thought of being around the hero filled him with fear. The symbol of peace knew everything, and guilt that he hadn't confessed his crimes already. Even after everything Sensei told him, it was hard to separate the man from the myth. All Might's influence extended far beyond the man himself. For Izuku's entire life the symbol of peace was this great symbol of justice that defended good and punished evil. Now Izuku found himself on the wrong end of that equation. Like a guilty child, he found himself waiting for the punishment that would inevitably come. Sensei had made sure he knew if he got exposed, All Might would kill him. He was lucky he could use nerves as an excuse as to why he jumped when the teacher swept through the door. He really had the air of an actor on stage, playing it up for the cheap seats, Izuku thinks, and everyone plays along with it. It was so fake, surely no one honestly believed it, but pretending made it feel real. That's why they did it. To pretend that if you believed hard enough in things like justice, they would appear. It was pathetic, but he knew that loneliness, that feeling of desperately wishing there could be something more. Sometimes the truth hurt too much to look at, and any kind of comfort was reassuring. Izuku felt guilty he had lied to his hero, and he felt guilty that part of him still thought of All Might as his hero. He breathed out, trying to convince himself that he was just another student here. He wasn't going to be singled out and investigated. He just had to act like the rest of the class, and everything would be fine. He needed to keep his mind sharp. This was the time where he had to do the most observation for his report to the league. The strengths and weaknesses of everyone's quirks, and their fighting styles, he needed to know them without giving himself away. Izuku presses the small device Mei has made for him into his palm. Such a small thing, but so useful. He hadn't been expecting it to be done by today, but that was his fault for underestimating a gadgeteer. He had paid, and she had produced a baby that performed beyond expectation. Izuku joins the rest of the students in taking their official hero costumes off the stand, and smiles. He hopes he hadn't been too much trouble. He had done a lot of research on hero costumes, and had ended up writing more than he should for specifications. Izuku undoes the clasps of the suitcase, and gets dressed. The fabric of the three-piece suit is silky smooth, but with an extra weight to it from the completely fireproof weave. Not only would he be able to wear flames without burning himself, the fabric wouldn't heat up at all even from prolonged exposure. He had tested a sleeve before getting dressed. A fitting outfit for one with psychic-based abilities, nondescript, and not flashy, but an outfit with class. Lastly, he slipped the gloves over his burn-scarred knuckles, and felt the weight of the devices in his hands. All he had to do was flex his fingers, and they would summon a flame in his palms for him to manipulate. As the gloves were fireproof too, he could throw a flaming punch in a pinch. Not that it worked as a battle strategy, but it was still so cool. The outfit included only a small mask that sat around the eyes. The lenses were tinted so he could burn the flames white hot without blinding himself, and see through smoke. It was an outfit that helped counter some of the weaknesses of the flame control quirk. With lighters in each glove, and 2 emergency ones in the heel of each shoe, you'd have to cut off his limbs to disarm him. Now if that happens again, he won't have to steal Kachin's quirk to defend himself. He'll have his own fire. Izuku is beaming when he walks out with the rest of the class. Katsuki calls out. You really are a robot bastard, aren't you? How rude! Ida protests from inside a full-body suit of armor. The full-body covering suits were starting to be a fashion now. Such a shame. It made it hard to tell who was who, what was their quirk, and what was their costume, and he still needed physical contact to steal a quirk. Ida was quickly becoming an annoyance. There was another full-body costume there too, what a pain. Izuku hangs around the back, watching everyone else with his eyes hidden behind the white lenses of the mask. His study had already begun. Prioritize targets, work out those who could be persuaded to join, and those who would never consider it. Arrange their quirks according to strength and usefulness. Who was too dangerous to try and harvest? Who did he want the quirks from? Who was no use at all? Who to kill, and who to spare? And don't mutter. Izuku catches himself in time. He has to stop that bad habit before it gives him away. It was unprofessional for both a hero and a villain. Even if speaking aloud helped him organize his thoughts, he would wait until he was alone to go over the day's events for the report. Izuku waits patiently, as All Might explains the exercise. They were going to be split into teams of 2 for an exercise that sounded like a video game mission. Half would pretend to be villains, defending their weapon, and the other half would be heroes trying to stop them. Simple enough. The real test here is one of adaptability. No one has spent long enough in the same classroom to have any real idea of the other's abilities. This is an opportunity to see how well one can work with a complete stranger. Izuku is crowing internally. This was the perfect opportunity to gather information. Sensei was going to be so proud of him. He watches the symbol of peace reach into the box to pull out the first pair of names, and wonders if it's rigged. The fact that Aizawa outright lied to the class more than once doesn't inspire much confidence in the teaching staff. The first pairing is drawn, and Izuku is surprised to see his number has been pulled. It would be too much to hope he would be paired with Katsuki, and he wouldn't want to fight him, but the small irony makes him smile. First match, Heroes, Ida Tenya, and Ochako Uraraka versus villains Midoriya Izuku, and Todoroki Shuto. Todoroki was one of his classmates that Izuku knew next to nothing about. He obviously had some sort of ice control quirk, seeing as half of his body was caked in it, but Izuku had no idea why. Todoroki wasn't the kind to want to talk about his quirk, he wasn't the kind to want to talk at all. Izuku knew getting him to open up would be a struggle, but it would be worth it if he succeeded. Todoroki had the quiet confidence of one who was already beyond this level of training. When Izuku had run up to him to begin discussing strategy, he was withdrawn, stating only he didn't need help. Even if that was true, Izuku wasn't going to accept that as an answer. He wasn't going to let something like Todoroki not wanting to talk to him get in the way of getting to know about him. The actual building they were supposed to be defending would be monitored. This was his only chance to get information off camera. So fire and ice, huh? At least we have a theme, Izuku jokes. Todoroki continues walking. Your quirk looks like it is useful. Izuku once again tries to make small talk. It is, Todoroki says simply, walking ahead. So that. Izuku gestures to the side of Todoroki's body that is covered in ice. Isn't that cold? Aren't you worried about frostbite or wait, what's the word, necrotitis? Todoroki looks at his ice-covered shoulder. I regulate my body temperature with my quirk, he tells Izuku. Raising the temperature of my skin counteracts the freezing without melting the ice. The word is necrosis, by the way. True, it was mostly factual, but he's got Todoroki talking in proper sentences now. Wow, so you can heat things up, as well as cool them down? Izuku says, and folds his arms behind his head. My quirk can only heat things up. It must be nice being able to freeze people knowing you can unfreeze them before they get hurt. Fire can be way too dangerous sometimes. Todoroki has a negative reaction to that, seemingly half flinching. Izuku can see his shoulders tighten as he straightens up. Had he had a bad experience with fire in his past? Of course my control isn't as good as a professional hero like Endeavor's, he says out loud to test his theory, and Todoroki stiffens further, shutting Izuku completely. Oh dear, he wouldn't have enough time to work him out of his shell again. All he got from that is that Todoroki wasn't limited to just ice, and had a negative experience regarding the flame hero Endeavor. That was unusual. Some that were saved by heroes chose to become heroes themselves later in life. That was a fact, and there were always some that were traumatized by those incidents. Izuku could count himself among their number now, but from the way Todoroki had reacted, it was the hero himself that made him uncomfortable. Izuku wondered what the connection was. What about Endeavor made Todoroki so wary? Even the mention of a flame quirk made him uneasy. Did it have to do with the way he only covered half of himself with ice? Izuku sighs. I didn't mean to upset you, he tells Todoroki, lying through his teeth. He had wanted to see what his reaction was. I just wanted to say your quirk looks pretty cool. Not that I'm trying to make fun of you or anything. Izuku stammers when he realizes the pun. It's fine, Todoroki says coldly, and starts to walk faster. I want to get this exercise over with quickly. Do not get in the way. Well, that wasn't a good sign. Izuku could tell there was bitterness in his voice, directed towards him, but not because of him. Something was troubling Todoroki, something he couldn't talk about without feeling vulnerable. Izuku wanted to know what it was. He wanted to help. As the villain team, they got some prep time to explore their hideout, and work out where they were going to hide their hollow nuke. This really was some golden age stuff, Izuku thinks, as he knocks against the false explosive's hollow shell, and hears it echo. What kind of plan would they have with an explosive like that anyway? Sensei had said that villains came in 3 classes. The first was those that used their abilities out of selfish desire to make their own lives easier. Those were the shoplifters, and purse snatchers that only thought in the short term or didn't think at all. The second were those who used their abilities to take pleasure in suffering and chaos. They had no goals outside of murder and mayhem, their only desire to do as much damage as they can in the way they desire. That was the kind of villain the exercise assigned them to be. The plan would be either to hold the city to ransom or detonate the explosive anyway for the fun of it. The third kind of villain was one that aimed to improve the world with their abilities. They cared about money, and influence, and power, but as a means to an end. They thought in the long term, and adapted their plans around events, making only calculated moves, and low-risk investments. That was the kind of villain Sensei was, and the kind of villain Izuku himself wanted to be. Izuku starts planning where to put the fake bomb. Ideally, they want to put it as far away from the hero team as possible, so they can use the other floors to delay them. Normally that would mean setting up their defensive line around the 5th floor, but what if they entered through there? He had no idea what Ida's quirk was. If it was flight, then the hero team could start their assault at the 5th floor. Of course, as a compromise they could always put the bomb on the 3rd floor, but wouldn't that make it easier no matter where they broke in? Please stop that. Todoroki tells him politely, and Izuku realizes he has been caught muttering again. It is disrupting my concentration. Sorry, just getting into character. Izuku apologizes. Battle! Start! All Might's booming voice echoes through the entire building. Looks like he's missed out on his chance to move things now. Hopefully their setup here will be enough. Lights, camera, action. Izuku breathes out to calm himself, and get ready. All eyes were going to be on them now. He had to perform his best. Todoroki breathes out too, his breath hanging in the air in a cloud of white, as the temperature of the room rapidly plummets. Ice starts to form on the windows, then run down the walls to the floor, as Todoroki freezes every room in the building. Izuku shivers in the cold, his costume not doing much to protect him from the harsh bite of the frozen air. A slick layer of ice covers the entire floor, crystallizing up the walls. It even starts to creep up Izuku's shoes. He sneezes, sure his nose and face are going red from the cold. Mind if I warm myself up? He asks with teeth chattering. The ice around his feet melts, and he pulls himself free of the brief puddle before it refreezes. He flexes his fingers, causing a small flame to spark in the palm of each hand. With care he draws it up around himself in a thread-fine ribbon that warms him back up. Did you really freeze the entire building? Izuku asks in awe, looking at the icicles growing down from the ceiling. That's amazing. This is easy for me, Todoroki tells him, avoiding eye contact. He extends one arm. I could always freeze them out. That sounds exhausting even with your quirk, Izuku tells him. Seeing as your quirk is more suited for it, can you stay here and defend the weapon with your ice? They'll run down a few floors and see if I can stop them with this. Izuku holds up the capture tape. With your amazing quirk you'll be able to keep this area safe even if I get captured. But if I can capture one or both of them, I'll make it easier. Just waiting behind an ice barrier for time to run out leaves us vulnerable to surprise attacks, so I'm going to go and slow them down if that's okay with you. Izuku blurts out, having gone over the entire plan without consulting his partner in this game. Todoroki nods. Be careful, any ice you melt with your fire will refreeze quickly. He warns him, pulling back the ice enough for Izuku to slip out of the room. The doorway refreezes behind him. The sheet of perfectly transparent ice blocking off the room's only exit starts to thicken. Izuku steps carefully on the slippery ice floor with capture tape in hand, hoping he doesn't slip, and falls in front of everyone on camera. The ribbon of fire keeps him warm, but he's careful to keep it from melting Todoroki's ice as he patrols the floors. A line of fire, as thin as a spider's web, surrounds the area of his effect. As he moves, it snaps, and he barely has time to dodge. The loop of capture tape only just misses him, as a black and white blur swoops past him. Fast, Izuku hisses under his breath, as he builds the flames up around him, as a defensive shield. The ice around him starts to drip, and melt with the heat of the white fire, though his suit blocks out all the heat. Ida whips past his flank, going faster than Izuku was expecting. The wind pressure snuffs out part of his flames, but he keeps his focus on covering a wide area rather than trying to match the speed of someone so much faster than him. He spreads his flames across the floor. The armored hero student slips on the next run, as the previously firm ice floor suddenly becomes slippery with water. Izuku holds out the capture tape, as they struggle to correct their path, and loops part of it around their arm. It catches, signifying a successful capture, before being torn from his hands, as the flailing Ida speeds out of control. Izuku sends a dart of flame to melt the more jagged spikes of ice before Ida hits them, leaving him thigh-deep in the resulting puddle. Izuku avoids the already refreezing ice, as he quickly runs forward to follow through. The armor has crumpled on contact with the ice wall, meaning it wouldn't hold up in a serious fight. Good to know, you're lucky Todoroki guarding the windows, Izuku tells him, as the ice he had melted freezes again. At that amazing speed you were going, you might have gone whoosh, straight through into open air. How humiliating to be captured so soon in the exercise. Ida sniffs behind his helmet. Oh, you didn't do that badly, Izuku reassures him, and he ties the unresisting hero student's arms behind his back. I have an idea, you can practice breaking out of that. That way if a villain ever captures you for real you have practiced in escaping your bonds. He tries to make it sound dramatically useful to cheer Ida up. Just don't join back and if you get out, he adds. Like I would be so dishonest. Ida sounds offended. Besides that water has hydrolocked my engine, I'll need to get it melted out before my quirk will start again. Engine Izuku is sure he's heard of that quirk before. Oh, do you know Turbo Hero Ingenium? He's my older brother, Ida proudly boasts. Wow, so you're from a whole family of heroes, Izuku says, impressed, before he pauses, and slaps his cheeks to remind himself. You're just trying to buy time for your partner. We'll have to talk later, he waves, as he leaves their first prisoner half frozen to the wall, and continues scouting for the other hero he has to capture. He should probably be taking this a bit more seriously, but he had to admit, he was having fun. He knew more about Uraraka's quirk than he had Ida's, thanks to seeing it in action during the entrance exam. It was some kind of levitation quirk that could be applied to things she touched, and while its limits were still unknown it was something he could work with. Again he spread out his tripwire of fine fire around him, searching for anything that wasn't ice. Using this method he could hopefully avoid being ambushed. He kept a close eye out for trouble. He doesn't want to be ambushed again. A foot breaks his circle, and Izuku presses himself to the wall. Uraraka had slipped up pretty close while he had been distracted talking with Ada. Time to step in before she got too close to the objective. Izuku tries to creep closer, as quietly as possible, trying not to alert Uraraka or slip over the ice. The ice made the ground slippery, and he had to be careful with his fire control. Too hot, and the ice melting made it even slicker. Too cold, and he could feel the soles of his shoes starting to freeze to the ground. This was no time to be staying still. Izuku draws the flames into spheres, and peeks around the corner, spots Uraraka, and runs forwards. He sends one of the spheres of flame to strike the ground in front of her, and melt the ice there. She jumps, turning towards him. Her outfit was pretty cute too, Izuku muses, as he spreads the flames out behind him in a blazing shield. I'm not going to go easy on you, so don't go easy on me either, he tells her in a clear voice, and sees her smile under her pink visor. She breaks a chunk of ice off one of the walls, and throws it. Izuku dodges out of the way, and Uraraka activates her quirk mid-throw. Instead of heading straight for him, the ice soars straight up, and shatters the icicles above his head. Izuku swears, and directs his flames upwards to melt the ice before it can fall on him. The blazing white flames turn the shower of ice to a blinding cloud of steam. He covers his eyes to try and avoid being blinded. Something shoves his back, and Izuku slips over on the slick ice, as his gravity is reduced. He falls over, but doesn't hit the ground. Instead he turns a somersault midair. Izuku recognizes the light, floaty feeling of having been touched by Uraraka's quirk. Through the clearing steam he sees the capture tape about to be wrapped around his wrist, and uses a burst of flames from the palm of his glove to propel himself forwards, and out of reach. Stay captured already, Uraraka protests, as Izuku jets to the other side of the room. He spins a bit, but manages to grab onto a spur of ice to pretend himself from being dragged away. Come here, and get me, Izuku taunts, already feeling the ice starting to grow over his gloves. Uraraka does just that, moving faster, and more elegantly on the ice than Izuku had. As soon as she passes in front of the doorway, Todoroki sees her through the clear ice blocking off the room, and raises a hand. With a crackle, Uraraka freezes up to her armpits. She deactivated her quirk, and Izuku feels the added weight fall back into place. Izuku breaks the ice around his hand with a burst of flame. Dropping to the slick ground, he walks up, and wraps the band of capture tape around Uraraka's wrist. Villain team wins! All Might's voice booms from across the building. Todoroki signs, and Izuku swears he spots a glimmer in his fire sight. A faint nebulous glow of gold about to become a proper flame, then a wave of heat spreads through the room. Izuku quickly extinguishes the small flame that remains to not overheat himself, as the ice bursts briefly into steam throughout the building. Uraraka sighs, looking disappointed in herself. Izuku helps her up from the melting ice. You did great, he reassures her. I guess Todoroki is just on a different level to us both, huh? If it had just been me, you totally would have won. He's not sure it's the greatest comfort, but it's all he has to offer. He wants to catch up with Todoroki after the simulation. He finds the ice quirk user putting away his earpiece, and quickly puts his own earpiece in the box. You did great in that match, he tells Todoroki with enthusiasm. Todoroki gives a half shrug to silently say, of course I did. I didn't know you had a fire quirk too. Todoroki always looked so composed it was almost gratifying to see the look of sheer panic come over him. Don't tell anyone, he blurts out, a layer of ice forming where his hand touches the earpiece box. Oh, why not? Izuku asks curiously. With a crackle of freezing air, the ice grows, as the temperature in the room drops. No one can know, Todoroki barks. I'm going to be the #1 hero without relying on his power. His power. Izuku makes the connection. A fire quirk. Todoroki's earlier reaction, so they were father and son then. Someone not wanting to live in their father's shadow, refusing to use an inherited quirk because Izuku has no idea what could have happened between Endeavor and his son to cause such a rift, but he wants to know. It could be used against him. I won't tell anyone if you don't want them to know, but you shouldn't be ashamed. He gives Todoroki his honest opinion. Denying your quirk is denying part of yourself. Hopefully in time you will accept that. He smiles. As someone who has a flame quirk, maybe you can talk to me about it rather than keeping it bottled up, he advises. Todoroki looks down, and notices the ice that had been spreading out from his tightly clenched hand. You wouldn't say that if you knew what it was like. He breathes out, and warmth spreads down the ice-covered hand, turning all the ice to steam, and revealing the massive burn scar around his eye. Izuku slips off his gloves, and shows Todoroki the burn scars that run up to his elbows. They have mostly healed, but his knuckles bear the permanent mark of his young self's foolish idea to throw a flaming punch. I might know more than you think. I want to think of you as a friend, Todoroki, Izuku tells him quietly, before a heavy knock at the door shows the next group is getting impatient. Todoroki refreezes his body, and Izuku hurriedly pulls his gloves back on. After getting their marks from All Might, Izuku invites Todoroki to sit with him, Katsuki, and Uraraka to watch the remaining matches. Todoroki says nothing, but he sits with them, and Izuku feels like he's made a connection. Izuku pays close attention to the other matches, and the abilities of his teammates. Todoroki wasn't the only scarily skilled one in their class. There were a few students with great potential. Izuku feels happy with the data he has gathered for the day, as they follow All Might back to the classroom. They are about to pass back through the gates when the symbol of peace stops dead in his tracks to receive a message. Izuku, joking and laughing with his new friends, nearly bumps into them, as the rest of the class comes to an ungainly halt. It's hard to speculate with only one side of a conversation going on, but All Might does not sound happy. Already most of the class are wondering in whispers what the delay is. All Might snaps his phone shut. All right everyone, he declares loudly. We're going back this way. All Might points directly back in the direction he just came from. This statement is met with a chorus of groans. Izuku privately thinks he isn't very good as a teacher. The advice he had been given about the battle was ultimately helpful, but All Might had struggled too hard to try and make criticism sound encouraging. But the gate's just there, the short purple-haired kid points out. Well, we have to go around the long way because there's construction. All Might's lie is incredibly transparent, and the laugh that follows it is incredibly fake. What's the problem with the main gate? Izuku asks, ducking under All Might's arms, and around to get a look at it. His blood chills. Nailed to the main gate, on the side that can only be accessed by students and teachers, is a charred black corpse. Even though he is still meters away from it, the stink of burnt wood and flesh fills Izuku's nose, and before All Might can drag him away, he vomits at the grotesque sight of the twisted corpse of Kamui Woods hung like a warning over the school gate. It was that face, that charred nightmarish face that haunted his nightmares every night, in front of him once again. Any trace of happiness, any feeling of security he had was sucked out of the day like a cloud had passed in front of the sun, and sapped its light. Even though the corpse was far away from them, Izuku could smell that thick foul reek of scorched flesh and cleaning chemicals, as surely as if the hero was still clawing at his chest. Dead to anyone's attempts to help him, he retched violently and threw up his lunch onto the grass. The students that had been closing around to try and help quickly backed off as sickness hit the ground. He gasped in a desperate struggle for air, and more vomit splattered the ground until he had nothing left to throw up. He pants as he struggles to suck in air past the bitter taste left lingering in his mouth. The phantom scent of the burnt body lingers all around him, and he can feel Kamui Woods' fingers clawing at his chest, those wide eyes pleading for help, and that horrible sound coming from that lipless mouth. A hand touches his shoulder, and he comes back to the world. "Zukin, you okay?" Katsuki asks him, moving his body to shield Izuku from the rest of the class. Izuku numbly shakes his head. He can't tell how much time has passed, but other students have slipped past All Might to see what has happened while the symbol of peace tried to calm him down. Now they are talking in hushed, fearful whispers about the hanging body, and whether the school is safe. All Might is trying to calm things down. He abandoned the tissue paper thin lie, and told everyone about the body the villains had left, as a declaration of war on the school. Now he was in open discussion with the other teachers about what they were going to do. Izuku knew he was meant to see it. It was a signal to him. The attack would begin soon. He had to be ready to play his part. These people around him, the students he had only just started to know, most of them will die soon. It chills him to the core. Even seeing the corpse of the person he's killed is enough to show this kind of reaction. What is he going to do if he has to kill again? He doesn't think he can take any more blood on his hands. Deep breaths, Katsuki advises him, and count to 10. Izuku takes a deep shuddering breath as he tries to calm himself. It's the smell, he whimpers. I can smell the burning. He shakes, the breath getting caught up in his throat, and struggles to calm himself. That body, that twisted blackened body, it could only be the body of the hero he killed. This fear he felt was never going to fade, was it? He can feel the cold hand of the ghost tighten around his heart. Breathing out, he manages to stand and wipe his mouth. It'll be fine. He lies to Kaken, who is looking more than a bit concerned. I was just shocked. He attempts to smile. Did I miss anything? His voice sounds weak even to him. The police got here while you were throwing up, Katsuki says bluntly. They're running a murder investigation. The entire gate's been sealed off while they investigate. The boy with the crow's head tells him. I overheard they've identified the body. A girl with extended earlobes says, leaning against the trunk of a tree lining the path. It's a hero that went missing not too long ago, Kamui Woods. This starts more whispering rumors among the class. A hero killer? Someone asks. What do you think it means? Another unknown voice says. Well, be safe here, right? The voices sound muted to Izuku, as if they were underwater. His vision is starting to swim too. He's been under so much stress recently, and now, Izuku passes out. When he wakes up, it is nearly sundown. You gave us quite a scare there, the elderly woman in the nurse's outfit tells him, as he sits up in bed. But I told them my quirk can't fix things like stress. There's always some poor student who cracks under the pressure. She pokes him in the stomach with the end of her cane. What you needed was a good rest. I'm feeling a bit better, he tells her. You're up, a cheerful voice says from outside. Uraraka. Izuku jumps, glad he's still in his uniform rather than a hospital gown or something. Ida ran you here after you passed out, she tells him. You've been asleep for ages. They've put the entire school on lockdown while they're investigating. With you being attacked, and that corpse on the gate, the principal thinks the school is being targeted by some sort of super evil villain group. A message has already been sent out. They're keeping all the students in the school tonight until they're sure it's safe. Uraraka pauses, realizing what she's saying is kind of depressing, and gives him a reassuring smile. But everyone should be able to go home tomorrow, and I'm sure we're all super safe here. We've got all the teachers to protect us. Right? Izuku clutches at the sheets, knowing that it's not true. Kaken was really worried about you. He's been checking in every 5 minutes to see if you're awake, Uraraka cheerfully tells him. Except now, because they're serving dinner in the cafeteria. She pauses, and thumps a fist against her palm. Oh, if you're feeling better we should go get some food too. Izuku puts his hand over his stomach. I am getting hungry. He had thrown up everything else, and his empty stomach was rumbling. Food sounded really good right now. Uraraka looks at the elderly nurse. If you start feeling faint, sit down, and concentrate on your breathing, she tells him. And take it easy. We don't want you passing out again. Izuku nods, and slips out of bed, following Uraraka back to the cafeteria, while she tells him about how worried his friends had been when he had passed out. Yeah, he had friends here. He feels better surrounded by people, where he doesn't feel at risk of being singled out by anyone. The cafeteria is abuzz with conversation, as Izuku gets himself some food, and sits down at one of their class tables. Everyone seems to recognize how shaken up he has been, and keeps the topic of conversation away from the gory warning at the gate. He appreciates it, and sits quietly, eating the food that seems to have the taste removed, feeling the press of bodies shielding him from the body that still hung nailed to the gate. There was an investigation ongoing. Fire quirks were common enough. It couldn't be traced back to him. Izuku tries to reassure himself. The League of Villains had been operating for years. They wouldn't leave a way to be traced. He swallows the last of his rice, chasing single stray grains with his chopsticks even though he is no longer hungry, contemplating going for another helping to drag out this time further. Something is going to happen soon. The anticipation hangs over him like a dark cloud that blocks the sun. A hand lands on his shoulder. Midoriya, my boy. All Might is smiling again, but it doesn't do much to put Izuku at ease. May we have a word in private? It might help the investigation tell if there is a link between this travesty and what happened to you. Izuku feels the eyes of his classmates on him, and breathes out slowly. He tightly grips his chopsticks to stop his hands shaking. I'll tell you everything that happened now, he says, managing to keep his voice from wavering. My friends deserve to know. Zukin, you don't have to. Katsuki starts to say. I do. Izuku cuts him off. For my peace of mind. Izuku takes a deep breath, and brings to mind his prepared story. After the entrance exam I was walking home from the subway station, and I took a shortcut through the dark tunnel. I didn't think anything would happen. I walked back that way 1,000 times before. But, Izuku pauses to breathe deeply, the weight of the lie settling on his shoulders. He has to be completely believable here. But the words are ringing hollow in his own ears. His own voice sounds tinny and fake. Someone grabbed me. I couldn't see anything when they grabbed my arm. I couldn't reach my lighter. His voice cracks at the end of the word. He clears his throat and continues. They grabbed my throat. I couldn't breathe at all. I seriously thought I was going to die. Tiny tears prickle at the corners of his eyes. That part wasn't a lie. They knocked me over, and I found the lighter on the ground. I wasn't thinking of anything but getting away, and I moved on instinct. Izuku sniffs, and viciously wipes his eyes, the memory of what had really happened seared fresh into his mind. I only saw their face for a moment, and it was burning. The smell, it was horrible. He tries not to gag at the memory of it. Then I ran away, as fast as I could. I was so scared that they were still chasing me, but I don't know what happened next. Maybe they were a mugger, maybe they were targeting me because of the school. I just don't know. The chopsticks snap, as Izuku's grip tightens too much, and he quickly drops them before he can get splinters. Seeing that body, it reminded me that my quirk is an incredibly dangerous thing that can seriously hurt someone. Izuku says quietly. Seems like you've had a rough time. All Might pats him on the back, and nearly knocks him into his dinner bowl. I'm sorry I can't help. Izuku apologizes in a tiny voice. It's fine my boy, it's fine. All Might tells him. If you remember anything else please tell us right away. Right. Izuku smiles back, but his voice still wavers. He pauses, trying to gather his courage. His breath keeps sticking in his throat, as fear makes him choke on his words. All Might, he speaks up just as the hero is about to leave. Everything's not going to be okay, he knows it. Whatever the League was planning, it was going to be terrible. The body on the gates was just the beginning. They were going to attack soon, and they would kill people. No, not just people, his classmates, the ones he had spent these past few days trying to make friends with. The people he had been laughing and smiling with. The people who had fought alongside and cheered on. The people who had been worried when he was sick. It had all been for the mission. It had just been to gather data, But he didn't want these people to die. He didn't want to be the one to have to kill them. He wanted to have happy normal school days unhaunted by the specter of his crimes. He wanted it so badly, because he knew he could never have it. He was a killer. They'd never accept him as a hero. He was such a coward. Be careful, he says quietly, and feels so small and weak. I have a feeling something bad is going to happen. All Might rests a hand on Izuku's shoulders. It's going to be alright. He smiles, because we heroes are here to help. Izuku feels his heart sinking. Even at this time when it mattered most, he couldn't bring himself to act like a hero. He does not sleep. He lays still in the bed made up in one of the great sprawling rooms of the school that had been repurposed with dozens of identical stretcher beds. There had been marshmallows, and hot cocoa, and most of the teachers and class had treated it like a planned event rather than a response to a crisis. It had been nice, a time to joke and tell ghost stories, as you got to know each other better. It had been carefully structured, of course, to keep the students from panicking while the investigation was underway. It felt like the last peaceful moment he would ever have. He lay still, unable to even close his eyes, waiting for the dread he felt to settle. Idly he watches his classmates sleep, closing his eyes if he thinks someone is going to pass by to check on them. A couple of times during the night they roll over or mutter something in their sleep. Once the boy with the bird's head rises to use the toilet, the shadow behind him is twice the size of a human, looming over him like a specter of death. Izuku freezes like a rabbit under the eyes of a hawk until it passes. Then the sun rises, and with it the first of the students, until Izuku can no longer deny it as well, and truly morning, and he hasn't slept at all. Despite that, he isn't tired in the slightest. He waits until enough of the class is up that it doesn't look suspicious to pretend like he's had a normal night's sleep. He says good morning to Uraraka after he prepares for the morning. Katsuki's still asleep in bed after everyone else in the class is up, so Izuku takes a moment to point out his peaceful sleeping face to everyone, before tipping him out of bed and running like hell. This really feels like just a massive sleepover, Izuku thinks, as Katsuki sits on his back and refuses to let him get up. Was he the only one here that was afraid? After breakfast, during which Kaken put natto in his hair, as payback, the teachers announced that the bulk of the investigation is over, and that the students will be sent back home at the end of the day. With sighs of relief and cheerful chatter, the rest of the school breaks up, as normal for the usual classes. Izuku still feels a sick anticipation in his stomach. He gathers up the breakfast dishes and takes them to be washed, making sure all the plates and bowls are neatly stacked up, as he tries to manhandle them into place on the already crowded racks. "Let me give you a hand with that," a student from another department says, reaching out to slide the last tray into place. "Ah, thank you," Izuku nervously replies, and a numbness suddenly spreads from the tips of his fingers up through his entire body. "Come with me," the boy says. Izuku lets go of the edge of the tray, the other boy walking ahead of him, as Izuku stiffly follows. He feels like his entire body has fallen asleep, but it's still moving without him. He can't even move his own tongue to protest. It rests heavy in his mouth like a fat slug. They move out of sight of the rest of the students getting ready for class, walking the opposite way from anyone who might be able to help. Once they're alone in the empty corridor, Izuku feels a sensation flowing back into his limbs. "I heard from someone in 1B you're the guy to talk to about quirk advice. You just wanted to ask me something?" Izuku splutters, audibly sighing with relief, and letting go of the quirks he had gathered to defend himself. He rubs his forearms, as if to restore sensation to them. Yeah, the student with the shock of blue hair looks away from him. "I want to know if I can fix this quirk of mine." "Fix it?" Izuku asks. "What's wrong with it?" The boy grits his sharp teeth. "It's no hero-esque quirk," he spits, as if repeating something he had been told over and over. "I'm going to get into the Department of Heroics no matter what it takes. I just need a way to stop people treating me like a villain, and give me a chance." "So your quirk, what does it do now?" Izuku asks. "You saw. I control people who answer me." The other student shoves his hands in his pockets. "Wow, that's an amazing quirk," Izuku gasps. "So you can control anyone?" "Pretty much, yeah, for all the good it does me." The boy glares at him. "Lucky kids like you with flashy combat quirks, and wealthy parents to pay private tutors don't have to deal with people being scared of you." He looks down, and mutters, "I'm sick of being treated like I'm going to use it to be a villain." "Well, why don't you?" Izuku asks, and presses back against the wall, as blood-red eyes fixate on him. "I didn't mean it like that. I want to know what motivates you to be a hero." Do you just want to prove them wrong? I just feel like a hero who I'm supposed to be. Well, that didn't really work out for me, Izuku thinks. The other student clenches his fists. That's a perfectly fine reason. Izuku grabs his hands and makes a connection. It just seems a waste to become a hero out of spite. I just wish I could have been born with something different. For a moment the blue-haired boy seems to shiver with cold, as Izuku tightens his hands around him, then yanks them back. Hot, he yelps, shaking out his fingers to feel the heat has already faded. Sorry, my quirk gets away from me sometimes. Izuku apologizes. But I suggest you take some time off after this unfortunate incident to really get to know your quirk. Perhaps you've just had some sort of mental block that's been hindering your true potential. The other boy gives him a look that shows he doubts that. But being late to class isn't going to look good for either of them. I wish you luck in the future, he says with false cheer, as he quickly rushes to class, leaving the blue-haired boy behind him. He was going to need it. Tamura was planning something. He had seen the preparations. He had seen the men getting ready to fight. He had a feeling deep down in his gut that today was going to be the day when All Might told them they were going to be doing some basic combat drills for self-defense, as the first lesson of the day. Izuku changes into his costume, but with none of the lightheartedness he had first felt when he put it on. The highly detailed fake city of their first encounter also seemed darkened by his mood. He can already feel the disaster looming, as the class lines up, like the moment before a storm when the air feels heavy with coming rain. Now then, the group of three All Might's voice trails off, as he notices something behind him that the rest of the class has only just seen. Then Izuku falls into darkness, the familiar black smoke billowing around him, as the shocked screams of his classmates abruptly cut off in the warp. The smoke clears with Izuku standing alone on a rooftop, some distance from the entrance. Kurogira's yellow eyes gleam behind him, as a smoky hand passes something into his unresisting arms. Most of his body has billowed off, transporting in the invading force. To have the anticipation broken like this has completely cleared the dark cloud of his guilt. Now everything is, as sharp and bright as a knife's edge, rendered painful to look at, as he looks into the open suitcase, and sees the mask of his villain costume. Rendered in perfect detail is a mask of pure immutabilium painted charcoal black. The bottom half is a lipless skull, teeth gleaming white. The top half is, in completely accurate detail to the memory seared inside his head, the burnt wooden mask of Kamui Woods. He can smell it, this new replica of metal, and paint smells like that foul smoke in his nightmares of burning chemicals, wood, and flesh. There is a faint ringing in his ears, a high-pitched noise far away getting louder and louder, as he looks at the case in front of him. As in the basement, he suddenly feels light inside, as if caught in the moment between stepping off a tall building and hitting the ground. For a moment there are eyes in that mask, staring accusingly up at him, and wide with fear. Get changed, Kurogiri says, his voice deadly soft, but with an order in it. You have work to do. Izuku looks over the rooftop, where even now a fierce life-or-death battle has begun, and with the phantom stink of fiery death filling every breath he breathes in, puts on the mask. The ringing stops when he puts the mask on over his ears, but the phantom smell of burning wood and flesh remains. For a moment he feels his vision shrinking, and fears he is going to pass out again, but it is just the eye holes of the mask limiting his vision. He breathes out, and the jaw of the mask moves with him, appearing to give him a second set of teeth. The lightness fills him to his fingertips. He can't afford to think of the future at a time like this. Every second he was still alive was a precious gift regardless of the previous one. No more doubts, no more hesitating, overthinking or making plans. Izuku gets changed into the suit in the box. Unlike the form-fitting suit of his hero costume, this one was cut to make him taller and stronger. The threads had immutabilium woven into them, making it stronger than a suit of armor, especially stronger than any armor the heroes would have. With the suit, the mask, and the collar of stiff metal plates he was immune to the effects of anything quirk generated. With each piece he put on he could feel a little more of himself slipping away until he wasn't sure who the person behind the mask was the same as the person the mask made him. His trembling heart settles. This suit, so much like Sensei's own, was proof that Sensei believed in his abilities. He wasn't here to be a minion, disposable cannon fodder to cause a distraction. He had graduated. He was a full member of the League of Villains in his own right. He wasn't here to aid Tamura like the rest of the Bata feeders. He was here, as the second All-for-One. He activates his quirk, and sets himself on fire. The immutabilium protects him from the flames far better than the hero's suit did, and even with the fire licking around the eye holes of his mask he felt nothing. Sensor would keep him from being recognized by anyone. With the cameras being blocked by the anti-transmission field, no one would be able to truly say what went on here. Kurogyri? The second all-for-one asks, his voice roughened by Sensor. Yes? Kurogyri sounds distracted. He uses his newest quirk, and feels his vocal cords tighten in his throat, as he issues a command with a harmonic resonance that can't be denied. Tell me where you put the others. He demands. Scattered near the center. 5 building radius, Kurogyri says, his tone halting, as he struggles against the mind control. Trouble shifting only you. Troops their orders to engage. Take me there. The second all-for-one orders, and feels the darkness engulf him. He steps out of the shadow, adjusting his gloves, as he does so, and looks around. As he passes out of range of Kurogyri's core, he lets the connection he had made with his brainwashing fade. He reminds himself to apologize to Kurogyri for using him as a guinea pig for his experiments. He finds himself stepping out of an open doorway into a scene from a movie. In rough gangs the cannon fodder is roaming. Packs of wolves out hunting for prey. He had to be smarter, and faster than them, and he had little time. He spreads out his finest circle of flame, and steps into dark places, the inconspicuous places, the places that seem too obvious to hide, and would be passed over. He walks into the narrow space between a few of the fake buildings. From above, a length of steel cable loops around his arms and neck, and tightens. Momo loops the other end around a lamppost, and pulls hard. Izuku stumbles, but manages not to fall. The feeling of being bound makes his eyesight narrow, as he builds up the flames that surrounded him even further, and reaches for the connection he had made with Momo earlier. It is a faint, weak thread, but short. Not taking the care to be subtle or gentle, he forcibly rips her quirk out of her head. The cable goes slack, as she collapses, and Izuku claws the cable away from his neck, and flings it to the ground. The flames grow up around him, obscuring most of his body with their glow until he appears to be nothing more than a man-shaped pillar of fire topped with a scorched black skull. The cable glows with the heat, lying against the ground, as he calms himself, and puts out the flames. After straightening his tie, and brushing the ash off his sleeves, he goes to check on his classmate. He checks over her carefully, relieved to find his roughness has just knocked her out rather than put her in a coma like his sensei did. He takes care, as he gathers her up in his arms, and picks her up, ignoring the way his arms are starting to ache from his outburst, made worse by the extra weight. He walks down the street. The buildings around here had been vandalized, mostly for the hell of it. This fake city didn't have any valuables to steal, but some of the mob had used their quirks to break windows and set things on fire. What are you doing there, kid? A pig-masked villain snorts as he walks past. I would like you to think about all the things a teenage boy would possibly want with an unconscious teenage girl, then rethink your question. The second all-for-one walks past him. He steps out into the center of a group of lackeys. He recognizes most of them from the mixture of gruesome masks and malformed faces. The sunlight makes them less threatening. The second all-for-one decides. Under the streetlights in a dark alleyway, each would be the stuff of nightmares, but together under the bright light of a new day they looked like a group of lost cosplayers. They've cornered 2 of his classmates, and are bickering over what they are going to do with their captives. It's an argument that has already drawn blood from each other. These were the gutter scum, only here for their own selfish reasons. The only thing they all wanted was a fight, and now that thin glue was no longer enough to keep them together. The second all-for-one looks at the 2 pressed against the wall at the end of the alleyway. They weren't those he knew well, hadn't spent the time to fully get to know yet, but they were his classmates all the same. Give them to me, he says coldly, and Sensor makes his voice hoarse and menacing. He watches a dozen variations of "Who the hell do you think you are?" and worse emerges from the group as, once again united by a common enemy, they turn on him. I am the second all-for-one, he introduces himself, and you will kneel and fall. Like a blooming flower, the villains collapse around him, those that had been silent following their comrades in response to his menace. He makes no effort to avoid standing on them, as he walks forwards. I am, he starts to say before something hits the front of his suit, and slowly slides to the ground until with a plop it sticks to the concrete. The second all-for-one looks at it. It's a soggy, unimpressive lump. The thrower starts to cry, loudly calling for help, as he clings to the leg of the other student. Listen, The second all for one starts to say before a particularly loud wail cuts off anything further he might say. Sit down, and shut up, he snarls, the flames around him growing in irritation. His real teeth show from behind the teeth of his mask. In trying to save your life. Ribbit? The taller girl gives a confused croak. Come with me, he orders, and the frog girl swears to fight. The second all for one sighs internally. You need to hide, he tells them calmly. By putting you in danger, my colleagues are putting pressure on All Might. The most heroic thing you can do here is keep yourselves out of danger until the fight is over, and keep your injured friends safe. You're a villain, right? Ribbit. The frog girl jabs a finger towards him. Why should we trust you to help? This was a hero's mask before, it may be again, he muses. But for now it is mine. I dislike unnecessary killing, that's all, he says, trying to keep his focus, as the smell of burning fills his nostrils. Don't make it necessary, and I'll do my best to protect you. Gank the short boy sobs, and tries to cling to his leg. Big blobby tears, and snot run down his face. The second all for one takes a step backwards to avoid him. In there, he jerks his head towards the door of a nearby building so far untouched by the chaos. He hands off the unconscious body of his classmate to the frog girl. She shouldn't wake up for a while, but if she does try, and keep her from moving about too much, she needs to rest. She'll have a headache, and will probably be thirsty. He looks at the building. I have no idea if this thing actually has running water, he admits. But it's not worth wandering out to see if you can find some. Stay low, stay quiet, stay hidden. He glares through the eye holes of the mask. And if I see you interfering, it might just be necessary to kill you, he warns. The boy yelps, but the frog girl calmly meets his eyes. He feels like he is being called out. He shuts the door on her, and lashes his flames against the door, charring the front of the building black with ash. He snuffs out the flames, they can burn too much, but leaves the ashy mark, as a sign to the rest of the villains to leave it alone. He flexes his fingers. It was a good quirk he had taken, very useful. A disarmed hero was no threat to him. In the space where the street turns, he is ambushed by the boy with the shock of red hair leaping off a lamppost towards him with his body craggy with hardened skin. The boy passes through the flames like they were nothing. He catches the boy's fist, and, as their sharpened skin tears through his gloves, and into his hand, he reaches into them, and tears out their quirk. He stands over the body of their fallen friend, and dares them to flee. When they both state they aren't going to abandon someone in need, he uses his brainwashing to force them to follow, as he picks up the unconscious body, and carries him back to the marked building. He gives his two freshly hypnotized classmates a command to stand guard over the area, and tell all that tried to do anything about it that the building, and anything inside it, was the property of All for One. He didn't need mutant-type quirks that would permanently disfigure him. He had no use for a tail, or transforming tentacles, so he let them keep their quirks, as he continued his hunt. He wished Head had more time. He should have had more time, but Tamura didn't care about anyone else's plans. This was going to be the only chance he would get to take the quirks he needed. He had threats to neutralize, threats both to his body, and to his identity. All around him is chaos. There is nothing but the hunt. Find those that were his precious property, return them to their proper place. He has to fight to make the connection he couldn't make before, bringing all his new quirks to bear at once, before tearing a fresh prize out of their heads. Some he was too late to do anything more than cut them down, and hope they got a good funeral. Those two he takes back, the burnt building becoming a place familiar enough to step to. In his head he keeps a list of those still unaccounted for, as he comes ever closer to the place where All Might was engaged in a fight to the death. Kirishima, Satu, Kuji, and Momo were accounted for, and unconscious. He could make better use of their abilities than they could right now. Wajiro and Shuji were standing guard at the door. Denki was found completely zoned out, being used as a dancing bear by the villains, and is shoved in a broom closet until he's no longer a liability. Aoyama, Siro, Jairu, and Mina were all dead. He covered up the bodies, as best as he could, and left the others to mourn. Turi gives up hope of finding. If she shows up, it will be after this has blown over. There were still members of his class he hadn't found. He hoped they were still alive. He asked the flies and the cockroaches to find them with his animal voice, and they oblige, leading him straight towards the ones he still had to save. The flames billow around him, turning him once again into the man-shaped pillar of fire, as he approached Uraraka Ochako and Ida Tenya. "I'll hold this one off," Uraraka calls out. the face beneath her pink visor grim with determination. "You're the only one fast enough to get out of this jamming field and alert the school. Don't." The second all-for-one starts to protest, but a lump of rubble from the ruined building nearby smashes near his head. "And your opponent here!" Uraraka calls out. "The sounds of destruction are close here." This is near the entrance where they had been warped away, and Kurogiri had warped the weapon to kill All Might. He could hear the destruction close by. This was the most dangerous spot to be. In his firesight he can see the sharp burst of Katsuki's quirk in that direction. He draws up the flames to encircle them in the blazing heat, preventing escape by any other means than leaping through fire. "I want to talk," he says calmly. "You're the one that killed Kamui Woods, aren't you?" She calls out. "I am." It is such a relief to be able to say it out loud. He raises a hand to his mask, smearing the blood from Kirishima's attack over the charcoal black mask. He sees the way Ida's eyes are drawn to the blood smeared over the burned scars. Yes, he was the one that killed Kamui Woods. He was a villain, and a hero killer, and now he was wearing his burnt face as a mask. "Were you the one that attacked Izuku too?" Uraraka asks. "He was the reason I had to kill Kamui Woods," he says, and feels it is the truth. He was overconfident in his own abilities, and in the end he was nothing but a frightened coward who didn't want to face the truth of his abilities. He feels like the mask is moving without him. The death of the hero was regrettable, but there was no other way. "I had no choice but to kill him." "Stand down. Don't force me to kill here too." It is a genuine warning, and it is with deep regret he sees Uraraka fling a barrage of rubble at him. He already has the connection he made to her, the connection he made when they first met, and he has let his curiosity get the better of him. He had grabbed her hands to get a closer look at her quirk. Now he tore it out of her, adding zero gravity to his abilities. She crumpled without a fight, the rocks she had been storing, as ammunition showering down around her, and he reached out with his flames. At the edge of his limits he increases the heat of his barrier, aiming to box in the already running Ida. The armored student puts on a sudden incredible burst of speed, and jumps through the flames. The speed at which he is going means he passes through the barrier, barely spending any time in the heart of the flames. The edges of the armor melt as he lands, ripping the still flaming pieces of armor off as he runs. The flames reach the edge of his range, and Ida leaps over the last starting flare as he heads in a straight line towards the exit. The second all-for-one reaches out, struggling to find something among his quirks that can still reach the rapidly disappearing figure. Marks appear on his fingertips as he grabs a piece of rubble and removes its gravity so it floats in midair. Grabbing the piece of rebar next to it, he gives the chunk an almighty whack with his new strength increasing quirk added. It screeches through the air like a cannonball and flies straight and true right through Ida's chest. He collapses, momentum making him bounce and skid, and doesn't move afterwards. The second all-for-one is cold inside. He didn't hate Ida. He wasn't someone he wanted to kill. He had been a classmate, a companion just like everyone else had. It has just been necessary. He stands there, panting, as the sounds of destruction nearby completely cease, and steps away from it all back to the bar where he knows the others will soon be waiting. He brushes off his coat, aware that even if the garment couldn't be burnt by his flames, it still got plenty dirty from ash. It didn't show up much on the black, but he would still have to get it cleaned. With his good hand he removes the tattered and bloody remains of his ruined glove from his injured hand. Kirishima's quirk thoroughly shredded the skin and flesh of his palm. The blood was starting to congeal black from the soot produced by his quirk, and the oil from the shattered lighter. He flexes his fingers, checking he could still properly grip, and ignores the pain that ran up his arm. Idly he wonders if that blue-haired boy is finding magical idle peace dove's calming melody as useful as he is finding the quirk he had taken from him. A quirk that created feelings of calmness and well-being in one the user talked to was useful, but it had been worth the trade to be obeyed. He doesn't have time to take off the helmet and relax before the room fills with a black smoke as Kurogiri arrives. Blood splatters the ground in a sharp shower, and what looks like a length of intestine falls wetly onto the floor. Multiple shapes materialize inside the smoke. The second all-for-one waits ready, calling his quirks to bear, as two figures fall from the smoke. Flames lash the air, and he bends them away, as the two students tumble into the bar. He recognizes them both, Todoroki and Tokoimi. The shadow spirit he had last seen, as a looming specter of death, curls around the bird-headed boy, staying away from the bright light that shines in Izuku's fire sight. Half of Todoroki's body is blazing brightly while half is covered in jagged spikes of crystalline ice. He gleams like a human force of nature, and the second all-for-one is awed. One hand smears blood into the white and red hair, the other buries itself in stiff spiky feathers, as he grabs them both to make a connection. Tamura lunges at them with his eyes wild, and his hand outstretched, but the second all-for-one darts between them. All 5 fingers touch his back, but the suit is immune to even Tamura's quirk. He takes a step back, and drags the 2 he is carrying along for the ride. They handle the first step rather well. Both collapse to their knees, gagging, and dizzied, but neither throws up. From above comes the sound of Tamura, without hostages to torture, destroying the bar with his bare hands. From the sound of it, I'd say Senpai got a game over. The second all-for-one tells his classmates, oh well, the bar needed a remodel anyway. With the 2 still incapacitated by motion sickness, he takes his time carefully removing their quirks without rendering them unconscious. Any residual discomfort they must feel is lost in the rapid, violent nausea that came with stepping. The second all-for-one crouches next to them. I just saved your lives, he tells them. He watches as the recovering heroes try and square up, only to realize their quirks aren't responding to them. The second all-for-one laughs, sensor making the sound rough and mechanical. I've taken your quirks from you, he tells them, summoning ice and fire over one hand, and coiling the shadow spirit around the other. I may give them back to you. The darkness looms, even under the bright bulb in the basement. The bird-like shape is twisted into more of a skull-like mask, the shadow body jagged, as if barely holding itself together. Bits of it, claws or spines, crackle from over its body like dark lightning, as it struggles against his control. The pair pause. I am the second all-for-one, he tells them. The one who has inherited the ability to render any hero quirkless, forever. I do not say this to brag. I wish to impress the gravity of the situation on you. He dismisses both quirks. You were taken to be bait in a trap, he tells them. You are here exclusively so the heroes will attempt to rescue you, and be led into an ambush. You do not have to be alive for this. In fact, my senpai would prefer killing you right now. Do not give them a reason to. Right now I'm the only one arguing for keeping you alive because I think you're more useful alive than as test subjects for my quirk. His voice grows quieter. I do not believe in unnecessary violence, he says softly. I do not kill for the sake of killing or harm others for the sake of seeing them harmed. We are enemies by necessity, not choice. He sits. I'm not asking you to forgive me or sympathize with me, and join my cause. You're both steadfast enough for that effort to be pointless. I am not asking you to believe I am a man of morals. I am asking you to believe that I am a man of reason. His censor-roughened voice growls. This is the point where smart heroes sit down, shut up, and observe their surroundings. The longer you live, the more likely you are to return with information worth having. Am I understood? There are 2 hesitant nods, and 4 hostile eyes trained on him. Tell me what happened in the fight. There is hesitation from the pair. Right, he needed a verbal response from them before he could use the brainwashing. I grabbed a hostage of his own. The second all-for-one decides to test the 2. The one I took this flame quirk from. He's pulling the Scheherazade gambit, offering me an interesting piece of information in exchange for another day of life. Tell me what happened with the fight, and I can tell you what happened with the rest of your class. That gets a reaction, and slowly, with much prompting, Todoroki tells him what had happened. Kurojairi hadn't been exaggerating the troubles he had with teleporting. While Izuku had ended up being neatly dragged away from the rest of the group, Todoroki, Tokoemi, and Katsuki hadn't been moved at all, as Nimue engaged All Might. All 3 had interfered in the battle, facing down Tamura while All Might struggled against Nimue and Kurojairi. In fairness to his planning, Tamura had nearly won the fight until Katsuki had attacked Kurojairi directly by detonating an explosion inside his body, and distracted him enough for All Might to pull free and launch Nimue out of sight. The second all-for-one feels a little sorry for his senpai. It sounds like Head had a rough day. That was when the League sounded the retreat. The second all-for-one knew the plan there. It had been one of the few parts of the assault plan he had been privy to. After the element of surprise was lost, returning to attack the school directly would be walking into an ambush. The only way to stay ahead was to take hostages, force the heroes to come to them, and attack them. As the second all-for-one knew, it didn't matter if the hostages were alive or not, as long as the heroes didn't find out until after the attack. By the sounds of it, even with his stomach torn open by Kurogiri, All Might had managed to pull Katsuki free before the portal had closed on him, resulting in the puddle of blood that had accompanied Kurogiri arriving in the bar. A lot of his digestive tract had been torn out, as well. It would be too much to assume that was enough to kill the symbol of peace, the second all-for-one thought. His teacher had done a similar amount of damage before, and it hadn't been enough. The dying man would continue to die, slowly, giving no sign of his injuries. Katsuki was unharmed, that was good. He had worried that his hot-tempered friend had picked a fight he couldn't win. In exchange he tells them about the rest of the class, listing the dead, injured, and unharmed before giving details on how they had died. Aoyama had been ambushed and gutted by a serial killer villain who enjoyed stalking pretty boys. The area around him had been greatly scarred by laser marks, but there was only so far someone could run before they hit a dead end. Jiraiya's sacrifice had saved Kuji, and Sadu, she had collapsed a building on top of herself to kill 10 of the villains that had been pursuing them. He had seen it go down too late to save her from the rubble. Siro had his tape cut while trying to escape, and fell 10 stories straight down. Mina had been suffocated by a villain that could control the air. Her body had been the hardest to retrieve from the massive pool of corrosive acid that surrounded her. If it hadn't been for his suit, he would have melted like the villain she had taken out before her death. He promised that if they had a televised funeral he would make sure they saw it. After that there is quiet. Why would you give us our quirks back? Todoroki asks. The second all-for-one turns his mask towards him. The age of heroes is over, he says simply. Whether it's by the hands of the League or by the hand of nature, All Might is going to die soon. When he does, what kind of world do you think there'll be? He pauses in somber silence. My senpai wants to create a world of chaos and darkness. I want to create a world that is fair. I have seen too many villains calling themselves heroes, and heroes calling themselves villains to think this world is fine this way. A new era is coming. I want to know the right kind of heroes are shaping it. One either commits and crime or they do not. There is no in-between. Tokoyami tells him. Censor makes his laugh metallic. Even if they are a hero? Should they be punished too for their crimes? Or do you think it's worth more to have a figure to believe in, regardless of their falsehoods? Todoroki is glaring at him pretty strongly. The second all-for-one feels like he is trying to set him on fire from sheer force of will. Please think about it. I want to hear your honest opinions later. He stands. You'll send your friend in with food once he wakes up. Don't try any escape plans unless you know they are going to work. He goes back upstairs, locking the door behind him. Tamura is curled up on the floor, gouging at his neck with his fingernails in the fine heap of dust that used to be a table. Tamura didn't take any kind of loss well, and this was a loss on a good plan he had made for himself. The second all-for-one ignores him. No attempt to comfort him would help at this point. Eventually his hatred would find a target, and he could be reasoned with again. You've made some bold moves today, Sensei says from the miraculous intact TD set. I am thinking more clearly, he says honestly. I have taken action without delay. You know I will not interfere in your actions unless they are obviously foolish. All-for-one says on the screen. He waves a hand. A searing wave of utter agony consumes the entire left side of the second all-for-one's body, as the wound on his hand forcibly ejects any foreign contaminants, and heals itself. The deepest pockmark from Kirishima's punch remains, a coin-sized patch of lighter skin on the palm of his hand. Wincing, and blinking back tears behind the mask, the second all-for-one straightens up, and tests his grip has not been affected. Aside from the new scar on his already marked hands, everything is as it should be. Your consideration is greatly appreciated, he tells his teacher. You have no objection to me keeping the prisoners? Not at all. All-for-one replies. I look forward to seeing what your endgame is. I strive not to disappoint, he replies, and bows to show his respects. Taking the suitcase from the floor, he excuses himself to the back room, and gets changed out of his heavier, more defensible suit, and into the one he had been wearing earlier. He neatly folds, and puts away almost all of the immutabilium suit before he breathes out. He lifts the helmet over his head, and places it in the case, closing the lid, and he is Izuku again. It is as if a fog has cleared, and he quickly avoids looking at the case to prevent the sudden urge to put the mask back on, and distance himself again. He rests his head against the wall, and lets the emotions flood over him. Silent tears stream down his face, as he bites his lip hard enough to bleed to prevent himself from sobbing out loud. He had been too late. He wanted to be a hero. Deep down inside him there was a part of him that would always want that. Nothing the League could ever do would snuff it out. He only wanted people to be happy. He only wanted a world that was fair. Still he cried, for those he couldn't save, for the one he had killed with his own hands, for the world that made it necessary. All Might had saved 1,000 people in one night. With all his powers he hadn't managed to save a classroom's worth. That had been just like him, just teenagers trying their hardest to be heroes. In the end he was still too weak to save them all. His sensei had said that it was not a weakness to mourn. A respect for the value of life was an admirable trait in a leader, provided it did not prevent them from doing what needed to be done. He had thought he hadn't had that strength, that ruthlessness, to kill for the good of his vision of the future, but he had. He had killed Ida, not because he had been a threat to him, but because there had been no other choice for the good of the mission. Izuku breathes out slowly, trying to calm his rapidly beating heart. It was so easy. He had been so calm about it, thinking it through like any problem his teachers had set him, so simple and clean in the execution. He was sad, he had many regrets, but in the same situation he would do it again. Izuku breathes in. He really was a villain now. Kamui Woods, the hero he had tried his best to help, could pretend that it was just his blind panic. Killing Ida was something he had calmly thought through, and then done. No more thought than squashing a bug. It was the mask. As soon as he put it on, it was so easy to pretend he wasn't responsible for his actions, that the second All for One was a different person from himself. But he had to face the truth. It had been the same him inside the mask, as out of it. That cold, ruthless villain who would do anything to accomplish their goals was him. It was the kind of person he really was, under the nervousness, under his desire to be a hero. He was someone who would kill to further his goals. He couldn't be a normal hero, but he couldn't side entirely with the League either. Their vision wasn't his own. What did he want? He had meant what he said to his captives. He was going to make a world that was fair. For the sake of that bright future he would do whatever was necessary. What did that make him? Villain or hero? Izuku realizes that the feeling of guilty and fear that had haunted him since he killed Kamui Woods had faded. He no longer feels like the specter of the hero is looming over his shoulder. The League had used him for too long. It was time to take Sensei's lessons to heart. The road he walked would have to be his own. If he let himself be someone else's pawn he would never find peace. Rising he wipes the tears from his eyes, and palms one of the stolen credit cards the League kept in a box under the sink. The lives of Todoroki and Tokoyami were in his hands now. For all those he couldn't save he would make sure they returned safely. That was the vow he made to himself. Izuku steps out and goes shopping. Censor by itself was a party trick of a quirk. The villain who formerly possessed it was overconfident enough to think he could steal from the League and get away with it. Without a quirk suited for combat he had been easy enough to deal with. The major advantage it conferred on him right now was the ability to go unnoticed, even though he was surely marked among the kidnapped, and pick up some supplies. He rejoins the captives with sleeping bags, and 3 big burger meals, this time, as Izuku. He pauses at the top of the door, trying to steel himself, and hoping he can act, as he's supposed to. Todoroki and Tokoyami haven't noticed him yet, but he can see them, waiting, and already making plans. "Hello?" he says, a trembling voice, and they turn towards him. For a moment Izuku feels a deep stab of fear that they will recognize him for what he really is, and his plans will crumble. The fear passes when Todoroki stands, and immediately asks if he is alright. Izuku shakes his head, but tries a weak smile, and says that he had passed out when his quirk was taken. His hands tremble, as he hands over everyone's lunches. "I'm not much of a hero, am I?" Izuku says, almost to himself, as he sits. "There's no shame in being defeated if you don't give up," Tokoyami tells him. "We will for certain find a way to escape." Izuku fakes a smile. The 3 sit in a rough circle under the single bare bulb, and eat their burger meals. Izuku tries not to sigh around a mouthful of French fries. The most stressful part of this was not having anyone he could trust. He wouldn't feel under so much pressure all the time if he just had someone he could honestly discuss his feelings with. The League didn't care. They didn't understand the struggle of genuinely wanting to open up to someone else about their crimes, and, as much as he wanted to, he could hardly confide in the other heroes. He still had to be careful not to give anything away. The conversation naturally turned back to their situation. Don't try any escape plans unless you know they are going to work. What do you think that means? Todoroki muses out loud. A warning? A threat? Are they trying to get us to trust them so they can get us to join them? It could be an attempt to induce Stockholm Syndrome by pretending to care for us, Tokoyami points out. Izuku, what do you think? Izuku looks down at the empty, grease-spotted paper bag. The second all-for-one he saved the class. As much of it as he could, even though he was a villain, he says slowly. Then he killed Ida to stop him from raising the alarm. I don't know what to think of him, he breathes in slowly. If we try to escape, and manage it, he will let us go, but if we failed he will kill us himself. A somber silence meets that, and Izuku breathes out shakily. Todoroki puts his hand over Izuku's trembling one. So we agreed, he can't be trusted, but he doesn't seem to want to harm us. We need to present a united front, as heroes, Tokoyami tells them. Otherwise they might try to divide us, and turn us against each other. We need to be honest with each other. Agreed. Todoroki tells him. I'll do my best. Izuku adds, feeling a small twinge of guilt, but knowing it is not technically a lie. First of all, are we going to try, and make an escape plan or wait for the heroes to save us? Tokoyami asks. We're all quirkless now, aren't we? Todoroki replies, and crumples up his paper bag, and tosses it into the corner of the room. What can we do, but wait to get saved? He looks at his feet. I'm not sure my father would even want to rescue me if he knew I didn't have my quirk anymore, he says quietly. Your father? Tokoyami asks, sounding surprised. Todoroki Enji, the flame hero endeavor. Izuku tells him. That's terrible. Tokoyami gasps. Izuku tries not to think about how comic surprise looks on Tokoyami's bird head. Why wouldn't he want to save you? My father only married my mother so he could make my quirk. Todoroki avoids making eye contact. My siblings were lucky. Father thought their quirks were too ordinary, and left them alone. But when my quirk first manifested, Todoroki keeps solid eye contact with the ball of greasy paper. He decided that I was going to be his ticket to the #1 hero spot, and started training me. He winces, and covers his burnt eye with one hand to hide his face. After I got this burn I decided I wasn't going to become a hero with his power. I was going to reach the #1 spot with my mother's quirk alone. I didn't want to be his son anymore, but he insisted eventually I'd get over this childishness, and use my flame quirk, and I did. His hand trembles. After all the promises I made to myself, was I ever anything but his son? It would have been better if he had yelled. That small, quiet voice filled with dejection seemed to suck light from the room. It was the voice of someone losing what little hope they had. To do Shudoku, and Izuku wonders how to comfort him without giving away what he had learnt about him through taking his quirk. A quirk doesn't make a person, and neither does their parents. Did I ever tell you about how Kaken lost that tooth? He yanks off a glove to show the other two the shiny burned scars that have permanently reddened his knuckles. The ridges of scar tissue have disfigured the back of his hands, leaving flame-like marks. He pulls back his sleeve so they can see the scar runs all the way to his elbows. I was quirkless until I was 7, he tells them. I was the only one in my class. I got picked on a lot by the other kids for having no special talents. Katsuki picked on me the most. Even back then I wanted to be a hero, but for a quirkless nobody it seemed impossible. He takes a deep breath. My teacher said that one of the first lessons in life a child learns is that fire hurts them. I don't remember it, but they said I must have started developing my quirk early, and ended up hurting myself. After that I subconsciously started suppressing it to avoid hurting myself. But then when Kaken started trying to hurt me I got so upset I ended up using it to hurt him. Izuku rubs a hand over the burned scars. I burnt my hands, and Kaken lost his tooth. We were lucky nothing worse happened. If I had just worked on controlling my quirk from the start instead of suppressing it, nothing bad would have happened. He smiles sadly. You can't hold back a part of yourself forever. His smile grows more genuine. But still, if that hadn't happened I wouldn't be friends with Kaken today. I can't promise anything on your father's behalf, but maybe something good can come out of this. He smiles, and puts a hand over Todoroki. Even if it's just a friend. Tokoyami nods his agreement. There's no bonding experience like being kidnapped together. Todoroki mutters under his breath, but his tone seems darkly sarcastic rather than tearful. Was that a joke? Izuku asks playfully, but there is no response from Todoroki. When I was young dark shadows scared me, Tokoyami confesses, and Todoroki looks up. There are no longer tears brimming in his eyes. I was just a kid. I hadn't heard of any quirk like mine. I thought it was a monster. It would hide inside me, and only come out at night to whisper to me. If I called out for my parents, it would disappear when the light got turned on, and come back when I was alone. That is sounding like a straight-up horror story there, Izuku tells him frankly. It was only after I started talking back that I learned how to control Dark Shadow, and now they're my reliable partner, or they were. Tokuyami's face falls. I don't think that second All for One knows what they've gotten into. It didn't look like they had much control over Dark Shadow. If they lose control, and there's no light, everyone is in danger. I have an idea, Izuku proposes. We should tell each other what the weaknesses of our quirks are. Then if the second tries to use them against us, we at least know what to avoid. He thinks for a moment. My fire control has a range limit. If we get further than that, he can't use any fire against us. What if he is using Todoroki's quirk? Tokoyami asks. Todoroki shrugs, not knowing enough about the fire part of his powers to contribute. Either way, if he is using flame quirks, the light will weaken Dark Shadow. He won't be able to use my quirk against us then. Tokoyami adds with a knowing nod. So if we were to plan an escape, it should be during the day, Todoroki adds, and Izuku smiles, as he joins the conversation. We shouldn't discount the efforts of the heroes, Tokoyami states. There is probably an organized rescue effort already underway. We're making a backup plan in case something necessitates we try and run. I'm sure we can trust in the heroes, Izuku says and smiles. Darkness engulfed them. The ground underneath their feet opened up and dragged them in while Katsuki with splayed fingers reached out to grab them. The darkness swallowed him to the elbow, then pulled him in further, as he fought to keep the grip on Tokoyami's hand. Like a sucking bog of black mud, the darkness drew him in after them, first his arms to the elbows, then his head was pulled into the darkness. A hand gripped the shirt on his back and hauled. Katsuki couldn't tell who had let go, but Tokoyami's hand was no longer in his, as he was pulled back into the light. The darkness closed after him, leaving solid concrete behind in its place. All Might's grip slackens, as with a puff of smoke he can no longer hold his transformation. Blood slicks the concrete in a spreading pool next to him. The barely healed wound is now a gaping torn-edged mess. His stomach has a great bloody scoop taken out of it, as if his internal organs had been gouged out with a spoon. A withered skeletal hand falls to the ground, as the symbol of peace struggles to breathe. Blood flecks his teeth and tongue, as slow dribbles of it run from his open mouth. Shit! Katsuki swears, as he rushes over to his mentor. Don't you dare die on me. Don't you dare fucking die on me, old man. Tears drip into the open wound, as Katsuki struggles to hold what's left of All Might's digestive tract inside his body. The withered hand rests on Katsuki's shoulder, smearing blood down his shirt. Communications are being blocked. All Might rasps with more blood running over his tombstone teeth. You have to go get help. But there are still villains here, Katsuki protests. As much as he wants to run and get help, he isn't sure if he can leave his teacher. In his current state, breathing was enough of a struggle. He wouldn't be able to do anything if a villain came to finish him off. I don't need you to protect me, now go. All Might slaps him on the back with what little strength he has left, and breaks into a coughing fit that causes more blood to spill from his open wound. Quickly Katsuki looks around the shattered wasteland of the battle site, where entire buildings had been ripped off their foundations by the force of the punches. There appears to be no one else around he can call on to help, but as he checks, there's still no way to call for help. He didn't know much about first aid, but he knew gut wounds were likely fatal without immediate treatment. He didn't know how to give. You need medical attention the most, he tells his mentor. I'm not going to leave you behind. As carefully as he can, he picks up All Might. Even though he could only use a fraction of One for All's power, he could easily pick up his teacher even when he was transformed. Holding him like this was like holding a doll made of paper. Katsuki tries to shelter him as much as possible while he runs, feeling their shared quirk giving each step more strength. His calf muscles are screaming in pain, but he doesn't have time to spare. He rushes towards the exit, hoping that there is no one guarding it. There are still fires burning when he arrives, panting for breath, and finds two of his classmates collapsed by the entrance. Uraraka could be sleeping if it wasn't for the bruise on her cheek from where she hit the ground. He swears under his breath, already making plans to carry them all out of harm's way, and goes to check on the robot bastard collapsed, and still against the concrete. A streak of scarred concrete, and blood marks where he has skidded. He is unconscious, but breathing. The armor of his chest has been cut away, and a patch partially taped over his chest. When he breathes in, the patch sucks close to the wound, and when he breathes out, air is pushed out of the untapped corner of the patch. Punctured lung. A hand rests on his shoulder, and Katsuki jumps, as Aizawa appears out of nowhere. I performed emergency first aid. He should pull through if we get the paramedics in soon. You're lucky I dropped in to check on you, All Might. He addresses the barely conscious symbol of peace. Aizawa loops the cloth of his scarf around All Might's wound to stem the bleeding. You're in critical condition, Aizawa tells All Might. You need emergency surgery, as soon as possible. Finally, he turns to acknowledge Katsuki. His face is unreadable, set with determination. Give him to me, he orders. I can move faster. Katsuki carefully hands over All Might. The hand the hero has clutched to his wounded stomach is bright red with his own blood. He is quiet, but his blue eyes are alert. Katsuki is relieved to see he's still conscious. There's a jamming field, Katsuki starts to say. I know. Aizawa cuts him off. You are not to go after the villain generating it. I need you to stay here, and make sure Ida doesn't die before the medical team arrives. Bullshit. Katsuki protests. I want to help. No time to argue. Aizawa orders, already turning to leave. I shouldn't be leaving you at all. Katsuki grinds his teeth in frustration, but has to admit he's in over his head. He checks on his two unconscious classmates, worried that something may be going horribly wrong, but he wouldn't be able to tell or help. He worries too about the classmates he can't see, worrying that they might be bleeding to death without him to help, and he worries that his mentor isn't going to make it either. He starts to wish he had a healing quirk so he could help instead of standing around waiting for someone who could. He silently snarls, and brings his two hands together in a massive explosion that echoes through the buildings. Whatever else happened, had let everyone know he was still here, and still able to fight. The cleanup is swift. The echoes of his explosion have yet to fully fade before the teachers arrive, and for a moment, Katsuki remembers that even though they are mostly retired, they make for a pretty impressive lineup of heroes. In less than half an hour he finally gets to see the rest of the class, as the last of the villains are mopped up. Over half the class is either unconscious or dead, those who can still move are shaken, and there are sirens in the distance. Once he makes sure the robot bastard is safe, and still breathing, and Uraraka is safe, he tries to find out what has happened to everyone else, as well as the birdhead, and the ice guy, who apparently had fire too all along. What was up with hiding your quirk like that? There was one more student missing. He knew without having to be told who it was, and felt his hand tighten into a fist. Izuku. The marked building, the masked villain who saved everyone, the declaration that All Might's enemy had now, for personal rather than practical reasons, become his enemy, as well. He had a special hatred in his heart for someone who would attack a school to kill one hero. Despite the attempts to round everyone up for therapy, as the sirens went off, and the entire school was evacuated, Katsuki slipped away from the group to see All Might, and tell him what he had found out. He hitches a ride in the back of the ambulance to the hospital, where he has to wait nerve-wracking hours in front of the hospital room, glaring at everyone equally, while they see how much of his teacher's guts they can staple back together. He spends about half that time getting chewed out by his mother over the phone, while she's audibly crying over the line. He's too busy stopping himself from breaking down in tears to argue back past a few whispered apologies while tears run down his face. The small TV screen is already playing updates on what the media knows, that a villain group has attacked the school in an attempt to kill All Might, killing 4, and leaving the symbol of peace hospitalized. Katsuki hides his head in his hands, as the few facts give way to rampant speculation on the part of the news program. They are already questioning whether All Might should be allowed to continue teaching if it is going to put students in danger. As if a hero's life could ever be free of danger. As if villains could be relied on to keep moral standards. He had known what he had signed up for. It meant that if all else failed, he'd sacrifice his life to save someone else. The members of his class who died had died as heroes, not as some convenient pawns for a political debate. This really was nothing more than a fucking tragedy. When he finally manages to force his way into All Might's room, the first thing he does is turn off the TV before sitting down and getting ready to tell him the whole story. You look like death, old man, he tells the withered figure in the hospital bed. I feel it. All Might replies in the quiet, raspy voice he had when not transformed. I talked to the other students, he tells his mentor. They say that one of the villains saved them. One of the villains? All Might sits up to listen, and Katsuki notes how on top of the wound from earlier the scarring would now cover half of his teacher's stomach. A villain in a suit with a skull mask claimed a building, and everyone in it, as his property. Katsuki spits the word in distaste. He identified himself as All for One. He watches his teacher tense, his hands clutching tightly at the edges of his blankets. The hatred for the villain known as All for One was something they both shared. The second All for One, Katsuki adds, and watches the look on All Might's face change. All Might grabs at him. How? Is his one-word question, his face contorting into a mask of rage, as he transforms. The students that were unconscious are waking up without their quirks, Katsuki tells him. They're saying they were teenagers, around my age, but if he took their quirks he wouldn't have known the name without hearing of the original. Shit. All Might swears quietly. There's more. Katsuki hates to be the bearer of more bad news, but after everything All Might had told him about the villain called All for One, he wanted someone to share in his rage. They said the second All for One took Izuku hostage. He makes eye contact, blood-red eyes staring directly into sapphire blue ones. I am going to get my friend back, and you can't stop me, he declares, fully ready to go against even the hero he respected. Bakugo, my boy, even I can hardly restrain my anger. All Might curls one hand into a fist. I promise in my life I will rescue those hostages, but it is too much of a risk for you to come with me. If this second All for One finds out you are my successor, they will attempt to wipe the One for All out of this world. It is too much of a risk. If I can help, there's no way I'm going to let you stop me. Katsuki argues back. Do you remember the promise I made you? No one, even you, will make me helpless, for my own good or for any other reason. His eyes burn. I won't let you hold me back from saving Izuku, he vows, and turns to leave. My boy, All Might protests, grabbing the back of his shirt. You're right. The Hero Association cannot let this atrocity stand. The hostages must be saved, and the evil wiped out. I can trust you to do what is needed, but please cool your head, and cool your heart. Preparations must be made. Taking action alone would be foolish, and doomed to fail. Fine. Katsuki sighs. I can wait until then, but if I find out you are deliberately excluding me, and something ends up happening to the prisoners, I will never forgive you, sensei. With those ominous words, Katsuki Bakugo at long last goes home. Izuku puts down the phone, and stills his trembling hands. The sensation of stepping off a high place has started to become familiar. He is beginning to enjoy it. It is the feeling of having been the one to cast the dice, and waiting to see where they will fall. Even if he has regrets, he can't undo his actions, so he has to go on with the weight of them on his back. There is a thrill to it that makes his heart beat faster. He feels like he is directing his own future. He checks everything is indeed in place, and ready, and breathes out. He is calm. He should probably be more nervous actually. He's worked hard. The heroes would be mobilizing, preparing a rescue effort, and running damage control. The amount of heroes who would be on standby would be low. He wishes he had contacts in the hospital that could tell him about All Might's condition. Knowing if the symbol of peace was up and about would make his own plans easier. Half of his colon was in the trash bag around the back, but this was a personal grudge nurtured through generations. Even greatly injured, he might risk it to save the students. He neatly disassembles his mask and slips it into his pocket for safekeeping. It will be soon. He picks up the breakfast trays he has prepared for the three and goes to find his prisoners. The front room has been in better condition. His senpai, in a twitching fit of rage that put Izuku in mind of a dying insect, had disintegrated quite a few pieces of furniture, and some of the floorboards. Now he spent most of his time curled up in a hissing ball of rage. Sensei said to let him be. Eventually his hatred would crystallize into a solid determination. He just needed time to calculate where, and to whom he could do the most harm. Izuku hoped he would remain, plotting his countless imagined revenges against the heroes, and not bother him. Tamura disliked how intact their hostages were. Being part of the league meant dealing with Tamura's tantrums. His senpai was as mentally stable as a rapid animal on a chain, lashing out at anything that passed into his sights. With such a deadly quirk, his first response to things he didn't like was to disintegrate it. It hadn't failed enough for him to really develop a standard plan after that. Sensei was working on that, and he had to admit, in the moments when Tamura focused entirely on something, he found a kind of genius unhindered by morality, or even meaning. Sometimes in his nightmares Izuku wondered what it must be like inside his head. Izuku Tamura draws out his name, as he turns towards him. Hair falls over his eyes, and he smiles. It is not reassuring. His hand darts out snake fast towards Izuku's head, but Izuku has been expecting him to try something like that, and grabs him by the wrist. Shall we see who's faster, senpai, your quirk or mine? Izuku says calmly. He's learned early on that you can't show any sign of fear around Tamura, and that sensei didn't care if one killed the other. It would mean the one who died was weak. Tamura smiles like a nightmare, and extends his pinky finger before slowly patting Izuku's head. Playing nice with your friends with the friends you betrayed me for? He laughs. No you don't, Izuku says bluntly. You'd have to care about me before you could feel betrayed. Tamura's smile grows wider. Why are you always like that, Izuku? He hisses out his name, and tightens his four-fingered grip in Izuku's hair. If I shake hard enough, will all your secrets fall out? Senpai. Izuku laughs, and pulls away from Tamura's grip. Tamura grabs his chin with 3 fingers. When I look into your eyes I see fear. He leans in. Playtime can't last forever. The friendship's happy fuzzy feelings aren't real no matter how much you wish and dream. I know. Izuku tries to keep his gaze steady. But I'm not killing them now. Better a dead hero than a live threat. Tamura says darkly, and let's go. Holding back is lying to yourself. Izuku leans forward. I know I can kill them, Tamura-senpai, he says, making sure there is no fear in his eyes when he says it. For now I choose not to, but when the time comes I won't hesitate. Tamura chuckles, and pats him on the head. That's what I hate about you, he says. You think you have all the answers, that deep down you'll know what to do, but inside you're still just a scared, pathetic child in over their head. Tamura grins, clinging to that pathetic delusion that there is something you can do to change things for the better, but you're lying. You pretend you can still be a hero, but you know you never will. Then you can hate me with all of your heart. Izuku pulls back. But I have food to deliver. Running away again. Tamura taunts. You can't hide forever. Someday I'm going to kill you. Izuku shoves what Tamura has said to the back of his mind. Any extended conversation with him was unpleasant. Knowing that time is ticking, he rejoins his captives in the basement. It is becoming harder to act nervous, and afraid after all he has done. He needs to keep the balance between acting well enough to avoid suspicion, and actually falling into his emotions, and getting swept away. Time was short. He couldn't get carried away. If he started doubting himself now, he would collapse, and never recover. You should never dwell on anything, Tamura said. He just likes seeing others suffer. Really, I'm okay. He reassures them with a frail, trembling smile. They didn't torture me or anything. Why would they only take you? Todoroki protests. Izuku looks down. The second all-for-one blames me for the death of Kamui Woods. He says that if I had acted like a real hero he wouldn't have died. He says quietly. How cruel. Tokoyami sniffs. Izuku, you're doing fine as a hero. Todoroki says quietly to reassure him. Izuku shakes his head. He's right. It is my fault, at least a little. But I promise I'm going to try my hardest to do the right thing, even if it's hard, even if I'm scared to. Even if I'm worried my quirk will hurt people. Izuku clenches his fists. I just have to. He pauses, and clears his throat. He said that evil should be punished, and good rewarded regardless of the labels of hero or villain, and that it is happening today, and we should be ready. He shrugs. I can't figure out what it was, but he also said that he might give us our quirks back today, separate from the it. But he could also be lying. He'd give us our quirks back today? Tokoyami tests to see if his quirk has returned, with no success. He seemed annoyed when I mentioned the attack at the school. Izuku says. I think he didn't mean for any of the students to get hurt. If something big is going to happen, maybe he wants us to be able to defend ourselves? Or he could be lying, as you said earlier. Todoroki warns. We can't get our hopes up. This is going to be something positive. This is probably some kind of test. Tokoyami agrees. Yet Izuku looks down, and sighs. Are you still worried? Todoroki asks him. Yeah. Izuku avoids eye contact. I was thinking. Even though he's a villain, I can't disagree with some of the things he's saying. I feel a bit guilty about that. Izuku looks up. Can you promise me that if we make it out of this you'll promise to be the best heroes you can be? He says seriously. Both nod seriously in acceptance of this bargain, and Izuku reaches out his hand. The three stack their hands on top of each other, and from above there is a knock at the door. With a genuine smile Izuku gives them back their quirks, then all hell lets loose. It was a commendable fast response, Izuku thinks, as he hears what sounds like the entire wall being torn down. There is a heavy thump from upstairs, the wooden floors muffling the sounds of the battle starting. He recognizes Tamura's familiar scream of rage. Sensei would help him, Izuku was sure of it. The other Nimbus were incomplete prototypes, but en masse they would be a match for weaker heroes. The outcome of this battle would depend on who exactly All Might could call up on such short notice for a rescue mission, and the state of the man himself. In honesty, part of him hadn't expected the phone call to work this quickly. He had used Sensor to disguise his voice, and placed a call to the principal's office. The message he left on the answering phone was nothing more than the location of the hostages in the building, to prevent a repeat of the incident at the school. He wondered if his attempt to force the hero's hands had been too crude, but, from the crunch, as the Numa lodges itself halfway through the basement door, he'd say it had worked out. Run for it! Izuku yells to them, as the basement walls crack, and fall apart in a cloud of rising dust. It'll cover you! He presses his hand to the wall, and uses Uraraka's quirk to keep the air cloudy. Not giving the other two time to protest, he rushes towards, fires off a gout of flame to deflect the Numa's reaching hand, and slips out the shattered door. He quickly puts on his mask, and, as the faceplates lock into shape, the Numa stops its attack, and goes docile, as it recognizes him. He points it in the opposite direction, activates his sensor, and slips back through the hole into the basement, as wonderful as it would be to find a nice vantage point, and watch things unfold. He knows he doesn't have nearly enough stolen quirks to match a real hero. His major concern was for the safety of the hostages. After that was assured, his only priority would be saving his own neck. If Sensei was bringing the Numas here, his senpai should be protected. If he stayed, he was going to be in great danger. His fire sight gives him a split-second warning. He braces himself, and reaches out with flame control, as a sea breaks over him. He remembers his training for facing a stronger opponent, and focuses all of himself into a single point, splitting the flames around him. He can already feel his strength start to wane. His flame control had gotten stronger over the years, but even protecting himself was like trying to hold back an ocean. The flames stop, and he stumbles at the sudden lack of pressure. If he had to exert himself any harder, his brains would have leaked out his ears. He swallows hard, as he tries to prevent himself from finding out what throwing up in a helmet is like. Just his luck. Stay away from my son. The number 2 ranked hero puts a hand on his offspring's shoulder, and turns to look at him. You're finally using your quirk properly. Todoroki looks away. People might die here, he says bluntly. I'm not going to limit myself. Spoken like a real hero. Endeavor turns his eyes back on the masked villain in front of him. Izuku knew his flame control was a strong quirk, but when it came to taking control of flames from someone who also had a quirk that controlled flames, it came down to a battle of wills. He doubted his desire to save his own skin outweighed Endeavor's desire to protect his child. In a way, he had seen this through. Tokoyami and Todoroki would be safe with the second highest ranked hero, but the fire in Endeavor's eyes was like the flames of hell. He wouldn't be making it out of here easily, and, as unfortunate as it seemed, he should surrender here. Flames still burned in his fire sight. He grabbed a handful of them without moving, and took advantage of the strong points his quirk had over Endeavor's. He could manipulate the flames faster, and more delicately. Counting on his suit for protection, Izuku builds up the flames, as large as he can, as fast as he can, and sets them spinning in a fire tornado centered on the 3. The flames themselves don't burn hot enough to harm someone with a flame quirk, but the flames aren't the important part. The rapidly growing fires suck the oxygen out of the air, and the spinning means no fresh air can reach those in the center. It had been the plan he devised for his teacher. Even with a greater control over fire, Endeavor needed to breathe. He trusts in his suit to protect him, as he aims for the hole that Endeavor had entered the basement through. Even with that, he can feel the heat of the flames, as he rolls through, and a hand reaches out to grab him. He ducks, running through the shattered brickwork, and into the light of outside. The building is so shattered he wouldn't be able to step there again. The familiar place where he had spent 7 years of his childhood was nearly completely unrecognizable. For years it had been a sanctuary for him, but now it was time to grow up, and leave such childish things behind. Izuku ran without looking back. Gouts of flame burst past him, as Endeavor broke free from the fire tornado. It had been a temporary distraction, easy enough to break apart with brute force. Now Izuku was no longer focusing on building it up. Good to know it had been effective for that much though. He is surprised to find he is still making plans, revising his earlier strategy to figure out how to actually take down the hero. He gets out in the open, closely observing his surroundings to make sure he isn't walking into a hero's ambush. In the open air he can fight better without fear of being cornered by the number 2 hero's overwhelming power. 3 Numu wander through the shadows, and he points 2 of the lumbering behemoth behind him to block off the pursuit, and sends the third ahead. Flames burn brightly around him, as he draws off what he can from Endeavor's attacks against them, building up a store of flames for himself, and placing his influence at just the right point to redirect each attack around him. It was a fantastic quirk, and one that was wasted on someone like him. A hero who would subject his son to such things didn't deserve the title, or the ability. He wanted to take that quirk away from him. It would make things fair. And going to destroy the enemies All Might couldn't. Endeavor calls after him, as 2 of the Numu tackle him from the side, and he blasts them away by igniting his entire body in flames. Endeavor smiles like a demon, and the glow in Izuku's fire sight is incredible. Can't you take it easy? Izuku yells back at him. M14. No mercy. The flame hero says immediately. When you turned my son, my family, you made this personal. Another sea of fire floods the fire sight, blinding him to everything else. He reaches out with his flame control, and shapes it into a wedge. The flames stream over his head, and the suit grows warmer from the force of the fire. He can barely breathe with the heat sapping his strength. Even with his eyes closed tight he feels in danger of being blinded by the glow. He could control the sun's flames, but it was clear the father's attacks were only non-lethal for as long as he could hold out against them. I don't want to fight, he calls out, as he shelters himself. Burn, trash. Endeavor looks down on him dismissively. Todoroki grabs his father's arm. He's the one that saved our lives, he protests. The others wanted to kill us. That doesn't matter. The flame hero ignores him. He's a villain. See how we are limited by labels. Izuku calls out to him, keeping an eye on the Numu. They were earlier prototypes, flawed, but still formidable. The scorched skin is healing over rapidly, torn muscles rippling, as they move themselves back together. Damage-resistant types. The more they were hurt by a quirk, the more they adapted themselves to defend against it. It would have failed against the raw force of All Might's smashes, but against the flames they are only getting sturdier. When will there be punishment for your pride, Endeavor? Sensor drops his voice into a hiss. Or do you believe you've done nothing wrong? He carefully moves back, trying to stall for time without provoking an outright attack. If he can play this right, he might be able to make things fair. So black and white, isn't it? He tuts. This world isn't fair, is it, Shuto? To his credit, Todoroki doesn't flinch at being addressed so casually. Endeavor shoves his son behind him, but Izuku has seen the hesitation in his eyes, and smiles under his mask. I trust you to do the right thing, he calls out, as the Numu recover and attack. Endeavor reaches out to stop him, and Todoroki intervenes. A spike of ice rises from the ground behind Izuku, splitting the flames around him before it melts into nothingness. He feels among the adrenaline rush a stab of pride in Todoroki for doing what he felt was right in defying his father. He hoped that he would be able to accept his quirk as part of who he was, rather than proof of parentage. Hold him, he orders the Numu, and they comply. Even as they burn, their bodies regenerate more resistant to the flames, and the deepest burns fail to strip away the muscle fast enough to release their grip. He uses the hardening quirk to strengthen his skin, and runs through the flames. The heat makes his black suit glow, as the metal in it lights up. Without the use of Kirishima's ability, he would have been burnt for sure. He pulls off one glove, as he sprints forwards, and slams his hand against Endeavor's forehead, using his flame control to part the blaze around his hand long enough to make skin contact. Todoroki and Tokoimi both bring their quirks to bear, ready to attack him. The teeth of his mask seem to smile in the firelight. Endeavor sinks his teeth into the arm of the Numu across his throat. The rubbery skin it has grown to resist flames doesn't break, as the flames roar around him. He aches to kill him. He deserved it. He deserved to die right here, right now, for his crimes or worse. He should be forced to live quirkless, worthless, watching his son surpass him in every way. That flame quirk would do so much more good in someone else's hands, in his hands. Would he ever get another chance to show Endeavor his justice? How much of what he felt right now was justified? How much was hatred towards someone who had hurt his friend? I could kill you, he whispers in the hero's ear where either of the others could hear him. And you deserve it, but for now I need your false heroism. Please save them. He runs away before the hero can break free himself. An opponent of this caliber was not to be underestimated, and there was no need to fight directly. As soon as he was sure the others were safe, he'd teach Endeavor about fairness. For now he needed to know they were going to be safe. Endeavor could protect them better than he did. Wait! Tokoyami yells after him. That's Izuku's quirk you've been using, isn't it? Where is he? The second all-for-one leaves the question unanswered, as he flees. Where indeed was Izuku? How much of him was the child he had been years ago, and how much was what the League had molded him into? Could he even say he was the same person? He needed an answer to that. That was why he was still here. That was why he had put the wheels in motion. He had a teleportation quirk. He could step away at any time, he reminds himself. But what happens here is going to be the end of an era. He had to bear witness, to see what happened. Once he stepped away, he wouldn't be able to step back. He was the second all-for-one. He would have to be strong where Izuku was weak. He had a duty to see this through to the end. It was a plan he had made after all. Let them come, he was here, as the hunter not the hunted. All-for-one seems to have teleported all the Numa to this location, and the heroes are being overwhelmed by the unexpected numbers. He doubts this has been organized. From his guess, All Might called in every available hero who would answer his call on such short notice. There were a lot of them. The attack on the school had enraged the hero community, but they hadn't been expecting there to be more than one Numa. This battle was turning in favor of the villains. The heroes were being driven back. He recognizes various costumes. Endeavor wasn't the only hard hitter that had shown up, and once the heroes discovered their weak points, the Numa would fall, and the battle would turn in the heroes' favor. They must have been informed of the Numa developed to kill All Might. They are treating each with greater caution than needed. He keeps to the shadows, letting the Numa go ahead to check for danger. The building has been completely blown open, rubble scattered over the street by the explosive force of the first attack. He can't see in the shattered wreck of the building where the League was or if they had already been captured. He bites his lip under his mask, and tries not to mumble. Caught up in his analysis, he doesn't think that he was possibly being hunted. The thump of the Numa falling was his only warning, and that was too late. He was already surrounded. So you're the one that hospitalized my baby brother, the hero in familiar armor says, as he approaches. So you're here to kill me for revenge then? The second all-for-one snarls. I wondered when you would be showing up. It is easy to join the dots on who this hero is. Turbo Hero Ingenium, older brother of Ida Tenya. He doesn't need to look to tell the rest of the hero family would be close by. Their similar quirks meant they were more dangerous. As a team, specializing in fast strikes, he builds up the flames he was wearing to discourage an outright attack. If they were moving fast enough, then their suits would protect them from the flames. If he burned the flames hot enough, it put their mechanized parts at risk of overheating. The best defense he had right now was using hardening with his flame control to discourage a direct attack. If his family members were even half as fast as him, then there was no point trying to intercept their attacks. He would be relying on area attacks to hit an opponent he couldn't see moving. Maintaining his flames and hardened skin, he reaches for another quirk to use. The hero's words sink in and break his concentration. He's alive? Izuku asks, his voice trembling beneath the effects of censor. Oh, the news sites had reported injuries and deaths in imprecise numbers, and he had been dreading seeing the funeral announcements, seeing the dead faces of those he couldn't save, and knowing that the one he had killed had been necessary. Izuku felt a surprising wave of sorrow sweep over him. Ida was alive? He had been so sure he had killed him, so ready to accept the consequences, but he had survived. Another one of his classmates was all right. The tears started to flow, as he cried in relief at this unexpected mercy of the cruel world. For the mission it had been necessary to stop him. In the same circumstances he would do it again. But to find out he had survived is an unexpected piece of good news. Is he going to be O.K? He sniffs, unable to wipe his eyes behind the mask. Ingenium pauses. It's a full face covering mask, but he seems confused by the response. He was obviously expecting a villain to be colder, even bragging. He wasn't expecting tears. He's lost a lung. The doctors said if it was any more to the left it would have severed his spine and gone through his heart. Izuku clutches at his chest in sympathy. He really had been close to killing him. The teachers must have shown up pretty quickly to help if he had made it. Unless we find a doctor with a full regeneration quirk, he'll need a mechanical replacement. He won't be able to continue as a hero. Ingenium continues, slowly drawing closer. I'm sorry, Izuku says softly. I wasn't strong enough to prevent this. It was true, he would rather have not had to kill him. It was an incredible waste of potential. He had checked to make sure Ida wasn't the successor during their practice exercise. If he hadn't gone and made himself a threat, he would have ended up safe in the building with the rest of the students, in direct defiance of Tamura-senpai's orders. Poor Ida with his dreams of heroism. With an artificial replacement like that, he wouldn't be following in the steps of his family. He'd barely be allowed to leave the hospital. Going for help had been his first and last great act of heroism. It really was a shame. I know it doesn't mean much coming from a villain, but I am sorry. People were hurt who shouldn't have been. Your son acted as a true hero in that moment, and his courage and self-sacrifice do credit to your family name. His bravery was commendable, and his injury regrettable. He bows. It was never my intention to leave such a promising student in such a terrible condition. If it could have been avoided, it should have been. Though I know my crime will never be forgiven, and you deserve your revenge, please believe I make this apology with absolute sincerity. This should not have happened. The hero in front of him has stopped moving. Of all the ways the Ida family expected this battle to go, it appeared none of them included an apology from the villain. It was not my intention or desire to cripple your brother. He acted nobly in the execution of his duty. The second all for one finishes, and straightens up. If you truly regret your villainous actions, then dismiss your quirk, and come quietly. Ingenium tells him, you misunderstand. I regret not making sure he was fully dead. The second all for one tells him, I dislike causing unnecessary suffering. His actions were worthy of a hero's martyrdom instead of a life of pain and weakness. He flexes his fingers, growing the flames further. A life spent full of resentment at a dream unreachable is an unjust punishment for an act of selflessness. It would have been better for him if he had died. I was prepared to accept the consequences of that. I weep for him, unfairly condemned, as a casualty of unnecessary violence. The second all for one's voice drops low beneath the masking effect of censor, as he steels himself. This is a merciless world we live in, and I do not wish to cause further pain and suffering to your family. For your own safety, please walk away from this. A great violence will soon occur here, and I will not be able to protect you. I would weep to hear Ida has not only lost his dream of becoming a hero, but also his family. This is going to become a stage on which one such as us cannot stand. And why would you say that? Ingenium braces to fight. The second all for one smiles under his mask. Because All Might has arrived. He had to admit, he hadn't been sure if All Might would show up, but there he was, striding onto the battlefield like heaven's stupidest angel here to make everything right. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. There were children of 5 who could tell this was a trap, but he had come anyway because he had to. He was here, as a symbol, the man who would walk into traps, and walk out of them again, the symbol of an invincible hero. He couldn't not appear, and still be the symbol of peace. It was the death of the dream, or death of the man. Given that choice, All Might had still come. How frail that image was, how frail this peace was. Did he know he was coming here to die? Did the man underneath the image, with half his insides torn out, feel fear or doubt? Had he made peace with death before he arrived, or was it pure hope that had forced him from the hospital bed? It was admirable the way he had sacrificed everything to hold an age on his shoulders. But Izuku knew, regardless of the cheers of the heroes, what stood in front of them was not a god, but a mortal man, as broken as the rest of them. What a beautifully predictable fool. What will the cult do when their god becomes a man? Izuku thinks, or do you live in denial with the hope that it won't happen? Not today, not this time. The one who holds the weight of everyone's hopes will be crushed under them in the end. And still he walked into the trap of his own free will. Here and now was where it would begin, the end of the age of heroes. He can see the glow of a new era dawning on the horizon. Did some part of All Might long for death, Izuku wonders, to so willingly step up to the executioner's block, and he feels a thrill at knowing he had played a part in this. He can feel it in his bones, a sick joy at the thought of seeing death, like the anticipation a child feels on the night before Christmas magnified by the occasion. What will you do? Izuku silently asks the imposing figure. To maintain that frail peace you've sacrificed your body for. A miracle is needed. How many miracles do you have left in you? Or are you a dwindling flame, clinging to a last dying ember of hope? All Might stood, and faced it head-on and, although he probably shouldn't, Izuku couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for him. Then he vomits. It is completely unexpected, and the nausea comes after, as he smells the foul black fluid forcing itself out of his throat. He coughs. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes, as more of the black sludge than his stomach could possibly hold spurts past the teeth of his mask. He struggles to stay on his feet. Ingenium takes a step back away from him, as the ooze violently spurts from his mouth. Stay out of the fight. He manages to gasp through the sludge, and his sensor cracks in the middle of the warning. Brace for impact, he gurgles, and spits out another torrent of the foul ooze, as the blackness bubbles over his entire body. He can't hold up the sensor, as he struggles to breathe, as the slime consumes his body, and starts to dissolve it. The rest of the Ida family step out of hiding. Control, damn. He splutters in his own voice, as the black slime sticking to his body covers him entirely. Everything goes dark. There is no sensation of moving like there was with his flash step. When the dark goo drips away from him, he is at his sensei's side. Izuku is awed. All for One was his teacher. He had to admit he felt something akin to hero worship towards him. Was villain worship a thing? But the image in his head was of a figure on a screen who was intimidating, and always in control, who knew everything. He had never seen the All for One fight before. Seconds ago there were buildings here. The clear sky was blue over the shattered plain. The scattered bodies of heroes and Nimue are like insects, speckling the gray debris with little spots of color. The only part of unbroken pavement is directly under Sensei's feet. The only things left standing are in a widening cone behind All Might. Izuku feels fear when he sees the hero's face. He is not smiling. Sensei! Both Izuku and Tamura yell at the same time. The slumped, unconscious body of Kurogiri lies in front of them, as All for One bends down and grabs both of them, holding them close to his chest in a tight embrace. My brave boys, I believe in both of you. No matter what happens, I know you will be great, he tells them softly. The skin on his fingers peels back, and darkness stabs into Kurogiri's body. Smoke billows out from the point of contact, as the unconscious Kurogiri is forced to open a warp gate. With a surprising strength, All for One shoves them both backwards into darkness, rising to meet his nemesis head-on. Tamura screams a long, high-pitched wail of despair. Tears run down his face, as he reaches out desperate fingers towards his teacher, and drags himself forwards out of the gate. Izuku grabs him to pull him back and, in less time than it would take to blink, All Might's fist is swinging down towards them like the hammer of a god. The smack of All for One catching it echoes. Izuku sees the muscles in his sensei's arm ripple, and a shockwave rips through the dusty air. Any doubts Izuku might have held evaporate in an instant. That look in All Might's eyes, the hero really was going to kill them if he got a hold of them. Go! All for One yells, and stay safe. As he falls into the warp gate, Izuku realizes that, after his sensor had been broken by All for One teleporting him, he had never reactivated the quirk. When he called to his sensei, he had used his own voice, and All Might had heard him. Darkness closes over them, and they hit solid ground. For a moment Izuku fears he is caught in the warp before realizing he has just moved from the bright sunshiny day outside to a room with no windows or lights on. Kurogiri lies passed out on the floor. Tamura falls heavily, as he frantically, futilely, tries to gather up the wisps of remaining smoke with his hands. The wisps trail through his fingers, unable to be gathered into a warp gate by hand. The last wisp of fog dissipates in his hand, and Tamura freezes, and stares at his empty palm, as his last connection to his teacher is severed. His senpai takes a long shuddering breath in, and screams. He falls over against the wall, twitching violently, and starts to gouge deeply at his neck with his fingernails. The howl is equal parts rage, and despair, and pathetic, as a baby's cry. It is loud in the enclosed space. Shit. The second one for All swears, not bothering to reactivate sensor. What would his sensei do? Senpai, calm down. Against his best survival instincts, he moves closer to Tamura. Tears are streaming down his face. His eyes have a haunted look, as he focuses on something unseen in the distance, and tries to mutilate himself with determination. He babbles between sobs, incoherent pleas, and garbled sentences. Izuku doesn't want to try and figure out what he's saying. Izuku grabs Tamura's hands, and tries to hold him still. It's like wrestling a scarecrow. The scratches on his neck are bleeding pretty heavily, and blood is caked under his nails. Senpai, look at me. He He manages to find a place on Tamura not already covered in hands, the side of his head, and grabs him. He forces Tamura's head around to look at him through the fingers of the hand he calls father. This seems to calm him down enough for him to stop scratching at his neck. His bloody fingers twitch. You have to focus, Izuku instructs firmly. With Sensei still fighting, Tamura needed someone to reassure him. With Kurojairi unconscious, it would have to be him. Focus, Tamura repeats back to him. You wouldn't want to disappoint Sensei, Izuku tells him. Sensei, Tamura mutters, and shudders, as if he is about to resume his breakdown. Izuku tightens his grip. You need to focus, he orders. Tamura's eyelids flicker, but he makes eye contact with Izuku. Looking into those sunken red eyes is eerily like looking into hell. Sensei believes in us, he believes in you, Izuku tells him firmly. You can't let him down. Now what are you going to do? Tamura mutters, and sways. A shiver runs through him. He snaps back into attention, his eyes fully focusing. He stops crying. I'm going to kill them, he declares and stands up. Kill them? Izuku asks. Kill every hero, Tamura declares in a snarl. Kill heroism itself. How? Izuku asks him. However I can. Tamura snarls at him. Even if you find it distasteful? Izuku asks. Anyway, Tamura growls at him. Izuku breathes a sigh of relief. Good to see you're back to your old self, senpai. He fits his gloved hand over Tamura's own, and squeezes reassuringly. Yes, Tamura still scared him, but a Tamura that was plotting murder scared him less than a Tamura that screamed like that. Even with his fear, he didn't want to see Tamura suffer a complete breakdown. He was alone in an enclosed space with him after all. Still, Izuku found himself nostalgically thinking of the fun times they'd had playing games together in the bar while Kurojairi bought them snacks. It was a good thing the League of Villains had their ill-gotten gains. Tamura had a habit of disintegrating the controller when he lost. Izuku had learned how to convincingly let him win. His gloating when he won was better than him trying to disintegrate the head of whoever beat him. Still, he had to leave these feelings behind him. After you've jumped was a poor time to thinking about getting a parachute. He knew what he had to do. Never forget the only meaningful thing you can do in this world is destroy, he tells Tamura, layering his voice with the hypnotic tone for his brainwashing quirk. What was that? Tamura turns towards him. Hate me for this, Izuku orders him. Now he has a proper reply. Despise me, dedicate everything you have to tracking me down, and destroying me. Make it your reason for living. Let your hatred fuel you, and give you purpose. Trust no one. Their only value is to be used for their power. Lie, cheat, steal, do whatever it takes to make their power your own, then kill them when they are spent. Tamura blinks hazily, and stumbles, as the brainwashing takes effect. Izuku has no idea if the quirk could be used like this or if Tamura is capable of breaking out of it. Hate the heroes for their falsehoods, hate me for this betrayal, and keep on living. Izuku thrust his hand between the plates of Kurojairi's collar. The thick black smoke was a strange substance, heavier than air, but lighter than water, and he had to press past its light resistance until he touched something solid and organic. It feels like an organ of some kind, and the sphere of power glows in it. Sorry, senpai, I have nothing but respect for you, Izuku tells the unconscious villain. I am simply making the most practical choice here, nothing personal. I'm sure if you were awake you would understand. I must go back to Sensei. In one smooth motion, taking care to avoid doing any damage to the frail piece of organic flesh in his hand, he takes Kurojairi's quirk and steps back. I'm just borrowing this for a while. May our next meeting be under more pleasant circumstances, he says quietly. Kurojairi, naturally, cannot respond, but Izuku feels a lot better for having said it out loud. He would make a proper apology afterwards, maybe send a fruit basket or something. I hate you! Tamura screams at him, and charges forwards. Goodbye, senpai, Izuku calmly says, and takes a step back. The dark room blurs, and disappears as, with a rush of air, he is no longer in the dark room. He takes a moment to quash the twinge of sadness he had left about abandoning Tamura, and takes off his mask. He reactivates sensor, ensuring that to anyone who didn't already know who he was, his face would be completely blurred out. Provided no one looked too closely, he should be able to blend in. His hero costume was lost when the bar was demolished, and with it his carry case. He would need to pick up a replacement soon. For now, he collapsed his mask into panels to hide, and seamlessly became a part of the crowd clustered around the television screen showing the fight. Izuku fought himself close enough to get a good view. There was still something very important he needed to. The news reporters are already calling the area Ground Zero. Shattered buildings are spread out from the impact point like the petals of a flower. It's a beautiful symbol, Izuku thinks, as the helicopter-mounted camera struggles to capture the action. A new age is blooming, genocide, and genesis in one. His teacher wanted the world to see this, and the world was watching. All might lose. Izuku wonders exactly what his teacher had said to him, or if it was his own fault that All Might seemed so agitated. Blows were exchanged faster than the eye could follow, each one marked by a rippling shockwave, and a sound like thunder. It is becoming painfully clear that the hero was being driven back, and the cheers from the crowd had faded, as every eye fixed on the screen. Then it happened. All Might made a single slip, a misjudgment in footing, and All for One pressed the attack. A fist enhanced with multiple quirks strikes the hero in the stomach, and blood splatters the ground, as skin tears open. There are shocked gasps from the crowd. In the next moment the hero swings, and Izuku bites his tongue to prevent himself from showing worry, as the punch collides with his teacher. The hero pants for breath, one hand still raised in the air, the other trying to hold in his remaining insides. Izuku hears the gasps going around, as the hero collapses to his knees, and they see All Might, as he really was. The symbol of peace looks so tiny on the screen, a shriveled skeleton of a man, so different from the image of the hero. It's just a small pixelated image on the TV screen, but Izuku can feel the history at this moment. In years to come people would judge their lives by where they were at this moment. The camera holds the best focus it can, as it zooms in on the still figure of the struggling to breathe hero. The crowd waits with bated breath, as All Might manages to stand. There is a brief round of cheering before his teacher stands, and pulls the last shattered bits of his mask aside. With a slow and deliberate step he approaches the gasping hero. Something is said between them, unheard on the screen, as All for One steps up to deliver the final blow. Drill-like spines of bone take the place of his knuckles, as his suit is shredded by the muscle growth. Fighting for every breath, as his blood splatters the ground, the symbol of peace draws up the last of his power. Izuku watches at an angle, as All Might removes the bloodied hand from his midriff, and transfers his strength to it to hit his teacher squarely in the face. As his teacher's fist swings around, the booming shockwave from their fists colliding actually knocks the helicopter off course. A few seconds after the sound reaches the screen, the shockwave reaches the crowd. A strong wind blows for a second, as the boom echoes through the street. He really was admirable. Izuku finds he is holding his own breath, as the hero manages to raise his bloodied fist in the air in a gesture of victory. A cheer rises from the crowd, and slowly, on the screen, All Might collapses. Izuku slips out of the crowd unnoticed, and calls on Kurogira's quirk. Black smoke billows from his pores, as he opens his first warp gate. There is some exclamation from the clueless cloud, as blackness starts to billow on screen. Taking a deep breath in, and ensuring his sensor is active, Izuku steps back onto the battlefield, and closes the warp gate behind him. The distant chatter cuts off. All for One turns his head slightly, as Izuku steps through. Lying eagle spread on the concrete, and he doesn't move any further. Izuku had never seen him underneath the mask before. It had never occurred to him that his teacher would lack eyes. Why did you come back? All for One asks. Originally? To kill you, Izuku says bluntly, and the words roll off his tongue easily. All for One rests still against the ground, but his tone gains some urgency. And Tamura? Safe, Izuku tells him. Not happy but safe. Izuku pulls the mask from his pocket, and drops it on the ground beside his teacher. All of this was my design, Izuku tells him. I'm the one that called the heroes. I told them where the hostages were to force their hand. I knew that if All Might showed up the fight would make you weak enough for me to kill you both. Just one little phone call, and it turned out better than I could have hoped. I took control. It's what you had trained me for, isn't it? To be your successor. To finish what you started. To crush everything in my path. Aren't you proud of me? He puts a foot on his sensei's chest. They don't move. I respect you, I really do, he tells his teacher, and tries to keep his voice level. He can't cry now. If he cries it will ruin everything. You're the first person who ever believed in me, but I can't stay as part of the league. You've lied to me. You've manipulated me for your own gain, and I'm sick of it. No more masks. No more being forced to do things I don't think are right. I am going to be the master of my own destiny. am not going to be a part of your plans any further. I'm going to create my own future. His eyes gleam. The age of All for One, and All Might is over. You've won. All Might is dead or near enough. All for One grabs him by the foot, and trips him over. Izuku immediately uses hardening to protect himself from a physical attack. All for One's arm comes around, and grabs him tightly by the forehead. Izuku is already braced for a mental struggle. Using his power, he curls around the quirks he already has, locking them in place so they can't be stolen, and braces for a tug-of-war. He hopes he can hold on to at least one of his quirks, and fears that his teacher can somehow make him fully quirkless for his betrayal. He was so ready to defend his quirks from being taken he had no defense against the sudden increase in quirks. His teacher poured the abilities into him so fast he couldn't distinguish the individual quirks from each other. They flowed in a great stream of pure power. Each one was bright as a sun, proof they had all been stolen from heroes at least as talented as Endeavor. So many strong quirks are given to him he feels some internal limit break, and many of his new abilities become unable to be used until he deactivates another. He is surprised to find he is not literally glowing when All for One stops giving him quirks. Every inch of him feels like it is filled with light. Izuku estimated his teacher has given him between a quarter and a third of his quirks. Facing this gift of raw power, Izuku locates the quirks of his classmates, and lets them all slip back to their owners. They weren't worth holding on to compared to this. The children at UA may have been the best students of their generation, but the power he now held was the power of the greatest heroes of the century. The quirks his teacher used on him to increase his limits have changed his body. Izuku felt his body shift to accommodate the increased number of quirks, becoming tougher, smarter, and faster than he could have hoped to be before. His urge to analyze kicks in hard, and he assigns the 10 most dangerous quirks to each finger, and activates the best of the defensive and healing quirks. He can physically feel his mind working faster, as All for One pats him on the head. You've grown up magnificently, his teacher tells him, and Izuku can't stop the tears from flowing down his cheeks, as All for One pulls him into a one-handed hug. I want to make you proud. Izuku's voice wavers under his censor. You already have. All for One ruffles his hair. I made the right choice in picking you, as my student. You will make a fine rival for Tamura. He had indeed chosen well, the ancient villain thinks. No matter who emerges victorious from the conflict of his students, he will have won. It was surprising, but not unwelcome to see how eagerly Izuku was accepting that, taking his first step on the path of genuine villainy of his own will. He was so proud of him. Sensei, Izuku whimpers. I don't want to kill you. I want to show you the new world I will create. All for One laughs. That soft heart will be your undoing. He warns his student. You give too many second chances to those that deserve it. You may think it's mercy, but to leave an enemy humiliated and shamed with the reason and ability left to take revenge will destroy you. A wounded man can hold many grudges, the dead hold none. Sensei, I will always give second chances, Izuku tells him quietly. But in my pride, as your student, I will never give third ones. If I can convert an enemy to an ally, I will at least try. If I fail, I will destroy them. You've shown me how to do that much. For the greater good, sacrifices will be made. Never let that heart of yours waver. All for One tells him. I know I can trust you to do what's right. My student, I have fought all night before. Even with his wounds he was weaker. He has found a successor. They will be a threat to you. Izuku wants to protest. It's impossible. He has checked everyone in the school, but he bites his tongue in time. All Might must have found someone outside of the school. His teacher laughs again. I believe you will do what must be done, my most gifted student. He slumps. 1,000 messages spring to the front of his mind, as Izuku worries about him, and all of his new sensor-type quirks feed him information. It's like a knee-jerk reflex. He hadn't even reached out for the quirk, but it had answered his need. His teacher had some thoroughly cracked ribs. Talking must have been painful for him. He could kill him. Even with the overwhelming difference in their power that made him shiver, Izuku knew he could do it. He should do it too. He could have been a hero if it wasn't for the man in front of him, but he owed his teacher too much for showing him the way of this world. He could have healed him. He has received a healing quirk. He could have used one of his teleportation quirks to take Sensei to somewhere safe, but he doesn't do that either. Even though he'd never have one from the Hero Academy, this was in some ways his graduation. He couldn't let others shape his path anymore. With everything he had, he was going to pursue his own way. He was going to take the third option. Not a hero. Not a villain. Just him. He walks away. The dust is barely clearing, great billows of choking white plaster dust like grounded clouds. Few heroes have survived or woken up to help the relief effort. Most of the Numu have survived the attack. It was what they were created to do. No one came here to the center of the battlefield. They all believed All Might would win. Every single one of them. Izuku goes to pay his respects. The hero's uniform is just as shredded as his body, hanging in strings from his upper body. Deep bleeding gashes run across each leg. He is not alone. Izuku was not expecting that. He hesitates. Please hang on. Katsuki holds his hands over the gaping wound that had been torn in the hero's stomach, as if he could somehow hold the blood in. The paramedics will be here any second. Please! He is crying. It had been years since Izuku had last seen Katsuki cry. It did not suit his face to look so vulnerable. There was something wrong about seeing Kaken cry like this. The withered figure of All Might opens his mouth. Blood oozes slowly past his tombstone teeth. All for one is he, the husky voice is weak. Katsuki looks up, and for a moment Izuku fears his sensor has dropped. He makes solid eye contact for a moment before Katsuki's eyes drop back to the wounded hero. Izuku has no idea of what to make of his expression. You stopped him. You saved us all. Now relax until... Katsuki doesn't get to finish the sentence before with a faint convulsive twitching All Might dies in his arms. The sensor-type quirks give Izuku flatline readings, so it was done. All Might was dead. A wind blows around this shattered wasteland that was already the grave of thousands. Izuku looks up. The sky sure was blue today. He closes his eyes, and feels the warmth of the sun on his face, and pays his last respects with a moment of silence while Katsuki cries. How the mighty become martyrs, Izuku mutters to himself. Shut up. Katsuki spits, rising from the side of the dead hero, and roughly wipes away his tears. Shut the fuck up. You don't get to say anything here. Katsuki faces him and, despite the tears still running down his face, takes a combat stance. The second All for One, what a load of shit. Cut the crap, and fight me, Izuku. Do you have me mistaken for someone else? Izuku asks, frantically checking to make sure his sensor was still in place. It was. He could feel the steady thrum of the quirk draining his energy. Anyone who looked at him should only see a pixelated blur, his voice mechanically distorted unless they already knew it was him. That quirk you're using to hide yourself doesn't work on me. Katsuki growls. I already know it's you. I'm not stupid. I can put 2 and 2 together, and I know my own friend. I see. Izuku keeps the quirk up for the cameras, but relaxes a little. And yet you never told him? Izuku gestures to the still body of All Might. Katsuki stiffens defensively. I never told him because I trusted you. Katsuki spits, and Izuku is surprised to hear how much venom there is in his voice. You've always been involved in shady business, but we've wanted to be heroes since we were kids. I didn't want to betray your trust by telling All Might about your quirk. I thought that if I just gave you a fucking chance you'd do the right thing. His clenched fist trembles, as he fights back tears. I thought they were holding you hostage, blackmailing you, forcing you to do all these terrible things. More than anything I wanted to save you from that fate. I wanted us to be heroes together. But that isn't the case, is it? You've taken the bastard's name. You helped him attack the school. You're even dressing like him. You didn't do anything you didn't want to do. Katsuki glares at him with tears rimming his red eyes. You could have saved them. You could have told the teachers everything about the attack, and everyone would still be alive. But you didn't? You wanted to play the hero. You wanted to make sure everyone knew it was you who was saving them. Izuku tries not to flinch at his harsh words, but he feels wounded inside. How long had Kaken thought this way about him? How long had Kaken pitted him? I wanted to believe you could be saved. I wanted to believe you were my friend. Katsuki's voice trembles. Go home, Kaken. It's dangerous here. We can talk later. Izuku orders him in the tones of brainwashing. The quirk hums in the back of his throat, and Katsuki stiffens. Izuku watches him struggle to fight off the order, as his body is against his will. His skin seems to be steaming. He grits his teeth, straining against the brainwashing, as it moves his feet backwards. His muscles stand out from his skin, as he tries to resist, but his feet still move without him. Izuku turns his back on him. He had no idea Kaken felt so strongly about this, let alone that he had figured out what he was doing. But this wasn't the time or place. He would have to explain it all to him at some later date. He's sure if they can just sit down and talk openly, Kaken will understand. black smoke billows from his fingertips. As he focuses on making a warp gate, Katsuki's retreating footsteps pause to Izuku's surprise. Like hell I will. Katsuki barks sharply, and Izuku just manages to turn around in time to catch Katsuki's wild swing. How had he broken free? Izuku didn't know enough of the workings of brainwashing to say, but Kaken looked like he wanted to tear him apart with his bare hands. It's a fast, powerful blow that he barely manages to block, grabbing Katsuki's fist right before it can collide with his head. The wisps of black smoke are scattered. The punch feels stronger than he would expect even from Kaken's level of training. He is struck by a feeling that he doesn't know that much about his best friend. How had he gotten so much stronger in so little time? This is not the time or place, Kaken, he says with a soft, deadly venom to his words. He can barely recall the last time Katsuki tried to physically assault him. He would have to be corrected. I'm not going to fight you. Do the smart thing, and stand down to let me pass before I have to hurt you for the sake of appearances. The helicopter hovers overhead, recording their every move. Even if they shout they won't be heard, but their every action is being relayed live to the world, live. No. Katsuki grits his teeth. I'm tired of you treating me like I'm some sort of pet or minion. I'm sick of being afraid of what you might do to me if I don't play along. This time I'm taking a stand. If you really want to do the right thing, you'll stand down. On habit, Izuku creates the connection, and takes Katsuki's quirk away from him. Most of the fight would go out of him without it, or at least it should have. Kaken had tried to fight him like this before. Izuku had made it clear that he could easily beat him up until he apologized, but Kaken didn't even flinch, as Izuku used his quirk on him. Izuku hadn't re-established the connection with Kaken for a while. He had been toying with his explosion quirk for years, so had never felt the need to. The explosion quirk slips easily into his grasp, but there is something more. It blazes inside Kaken's chest, larger and stronger than any quirk he had seen before. It spreads the light of power into his limbs, and outlines his entire body. Izuku immediately wants it, but as soon as he reaches for it there is a harsh resistance against him. It feels like the pressure of many hands pushing him away. With determination he pits himself harder against the resistance until the quirk rejects him so hard it hurts. The quirk that could not be stolen, one for all. So it's you, Izuku says softly, almost to himself. I won't let you make me feel helpless ever again. Katsuki snarls. Of course it would be his closest friend who All Might had chosen, the only one he hadn't investigated. He had trusted Kaken too much. He had learned of All for One through All Might. After that it can have been hard to link his teacher's quirk with his own. Yet he had kept his secret from All Might rather than sending the symbol of peace after his head. Why? Because he thought the heroes could somehow help? Izuku's eyes blazed with anger at the thought of Katsuki pitying him. No, there was no other path he could have walked. He could not afford to have regrets. He had to move forwards into the future. He had to, for the sake of those who died. If he didn't, it would be accepting they had died for no reason, and he couldn't do that. He blinks away the tears threatening to form in his eyes. He can't let his emotions take him over. Not here, not now. Izuku really looks at his closest friend. He had been so wrapped up with the League he had been neglecting his oldest friend. How long had he been feeling this way? He should have been a better friend to him. He hopes there's still time to make this right. Kaken, this doesn't have to be our fight, he says sincerely. You're my closest friend. I'm not going to hold a grudge because our teachers did. I'm not going to follow All for One anymore. I am going to show the world my own justice. Izuku reaches out a hand to him. We don't have to be enemies. The excitement is clear in his voice, as possibilities come to mind. If you help me we can end decades of rivalry, and work together. All for one, and one for all, as one. You don't get it, do you? Katsuki says firmly, and swats away his hand. I'm not your henchman, Izuku. I don't believe in your kind of justice, and am not going to help you create a world where people are scared you're going to take their quirks. Katsuki swings his other hand at him. Izuku dodges, and lets him go, feeling the quirks his teacher had used to enhance his body increase his reaction time, as he tries to create some distance. Katsuki presses in close, going on the offensive, and driving him back. Even with the immutabilium suit, Izuku struggles to defend against blows that feel like they're from a sledgehammer. Kaken isn't letting him have the space to think, and all his more powerful quirks would kill them both at close range. Izuku bolsters his defenses with a shell of oily black metal, and tries again to reach his friend. You overreact. A quirk isn't an integral part of a person, It isn't the crucial core of their being. A quirk is a tool that should be used by those most qualified to use them. Quirks should only be possessed by the deserving, Izuku states calmly, as if this was a debate instead of a fist fight. Those who are not should experience helplessness. It is the only way a fair world can be made. With you, as a self-appointed judge of the worth of humanity? Katsuki growls, and tries an uppercut. Izuku takes a step backwards to dodge with minimal effort, guessing Katsuki will end up tiring himself out. Only a villain would think a fair world can be made that way. Don't heroes do that every day? Izuku yells back. Who is more worthy? The heroes who hold their position out of desire for fame and admiration? Those who join because it allows them to get away with violence? Or just the ones you judge as the good ones? He dodges another one of Katsuki's swings. This fight is going nowhere. They know each other's moves too well. Kaken is faster and stronger than Izuku has ever seen him, but nowhere near All Might's level. The quirks his sensei gave him are letting him match pace. Izuku knows if he wanted to, he could probably blow Kaken away and leave, but he wants to make his point. He wants his friend to understand, not murder him. I may be remembered as a villain, but the first step to making a better world is to believe I can, Izuku declares. No! Katsuki roars. His crimson eyes are gleaming with rage. You don't get to decide. You don't get to decide for all those people what is right. They have to find out for themselves. They have to learn, and grow, and make mistakes on their own. Katsuki's hammer of a blow misses Izuku, and smashes the concrete at their feet. Rubble showers down. The same people who saw you in danger, and would have watched you die, Kaken. Izuku hisses, keeping a wary eye on Kaken's fists. The same people who spend every day capable of doing something, and leave it to someone else? These are the people you have faith in. He can see that Katsuki's frustration makes him sloppy. His swings are wild, and using too much energy, whereas Izuku's movements are carefully calculated for the minimum of waste. Izuku feels like he is flying. Even without the mask, he still somehow feels he is wearing it, a barrier between him and the things he is doing and saying. To be able to make someone break down just by talking to them, this was his teacher's specialty. Snake fast, Izuku strikes his first blow, detonating an explosion against the side of Katsuki's head. Katsuki rocks, the sound echoing, as it temporarily deafens him. Izuku sweeps his feet from under him, and drives a punch in by his head with another explosion. Katsuki learns how to fall properly, and rolls out of the way. Streaks of black ash bloom around the strike site. Izuku slowly walks forward, flames circling his fists, and growing stronger. He drives another explosive punch into the ground, forcing Katsuki to crawl out of the way to avoid being hit. Don't I have a right to help anyone who can be helped? Izuku snaps, as Katsuki rolls to his feet, and he hits him in the chest with an explosion-powered punch that sends him slamming into the wall. Katsuki takes a boxing stance, and jabs out with a right hook. Izuku ducks, and Katsuki drives his knee into Izuku's stomach. The immutabilium can only deaden some of the shock, and he coughs up a glob of yellowish vomit. He curses his own complacency for assuming Katsuki could only use punches. Katsuki hammers him over the head, and his ears ring. Blood bursts in Izuku's mouth. I will correct this unfair world. Izuku spits, and feels inside him some of the rage he had felt the first and last time they had really fought. I will be justice. With a whoosh he summons Endeavor's quirk, and sets himself on fire. The flames crawl over the black fabric of his suit, the immutabilium protecting him from the worst of the flames. With the slick black shell coating his limbs, he is more solidly armored than with Kirishima's hardening. If he can't knock some sense into his friend, he's going to have to knock him out. He then calls on his enhancing quirks. The metal shell grows into spiked gauntlets that armor each fist. Surrounded in flames, he smacks his fists together. The resulting explosion generates a bright flash, and a billowing cloud of black smoke by way of demonstration. He swings hard, and Katsuki blocks. The explosion knocks him back a few steps, even with his quirk. Izuku can see him straining. Steam rises from his body, as he struggles to bring out more of his quirk's potential. Izuku realizes to his glee that Katsuki's One for All was underdeveloped. His teacher had told him that the One for All was like a flame. Once passed on, it would slowly start to burn. Katsuki had received the power recently. Izuku estimates he's only capable of bringing out 5% of its power. With the extra strength he has received from his teacher, Izuku was stronger than him. He can see by the look in his eyes that Katsuki knows it too. He builds up his strength for a final fight-ending blow directed at Katsuki's head. Are people born equal to Kaken? Tell me that. Izuku yells, and directs a final blow at him. With blood running down the side of his head, Katsuki screams wordlessly, and draws back his hand. His skin seems to flash red, as his fist hits Izuku's, and with a crack Izuku feels first the defensive black shell, then the bones of his right arm shatter. The shockwave stirs the dust. Izuku manages to stay on his feet, and bites back a scream of pain. Katsuki sweeps him up, and pins him against a jutting piece of rubble that was all that remained of the bar's walls. Izuku's broken arm dangles uselessly, his good arm swept up against his throat. You've killed! Katsuki yells in Izuku's face. If he still had his quirk, explosions would be bursting from his palms. His arm presses heavily against Izuku's throat, holding him pinned. His feet dangle inches off the ground. The flames go out. Don't you think I know that? Izuku yells back at him with tears pricking his eyes. Do you think it doesn't haunt me? His voice cracks, as he bites back tears. His composure breaks, and he looks down, shoulders shaking, as he holds back his tears. I have to do something. I have to make that sacrifice mean something. He looks Katsuki dead in the eyes, and a single desperate tear oozes down his bruised cheek. I can't have killed him for nothing. You want to have an excuse so badly, Katsuki says quietly. You're going to be arrested, Izuku. You're going to go to jail. You are a villain, and you're going to answer for your crimes. Izuku goes limp, pinned against the wall. Please, if you can do one thing for me, tell my mother I died, he says softly. Katsuki forces him to make eye contact. His red eyes are merciless. My friend Izuku is dead. Kaken, even if you think of me as a villain, they'll always remember you, as my friend, Izuku says softly, and smiles. Blood mottles his teeth, highlighting the hole where Katsuki's punch has knocked out one of his teeth. He slams his broken hand against the wall behind him, and detonates the largest explosion he can manage. Kicking back against the crumbling wall, he takes a step. Katsuki stumbles forwards, as the weight disappears. You never thought I was your friend, he says to the fading afterimage. I was always just a tool to you. He sits by the body of All Might, and cries bitter tears, as the heroes arrive too late to save this day. Later the news would report Midoriya Izuku among the casualties, while Katsuki made the real situation clear for anyone that needed to know. All for One was consigned to indefinite confinement in the most secure prison possible. He didn't seem too concerned. The mask of the second All for One was recovered from the scene, but nobody was found. A candlelight vigil was held for All Might, as the world mourned. In these dark times the world was asked to come together. The area was made a memorial site in honor of all those who had lost their lives in the battle. For a week there was peace. Villains had swarmed the city seeking to defeat or ally themselves with the villain that had killed All Might, but were held in check by an unknown power. The Hero Association struggled to reform after two high-profile incidents so close together with the culprits still at large. Rather than demoralize the public, they chose to cover up a certain incident. On the night that All Might died, a villain known as Justice infiltrated every high-security prison, and removed the quirks of 60% of the prison population, taking a remaining 10% with him, as they declared themselves the symbol of the new age, the Age of Justice. It would later be known as the Age of Iron. With a force of under 100 incredibly loyal soldiers, the villain known as Justice, also known as the Lord of Justice, completely took over the criminal underworld. There was a brief period of calm following the death of All Might, as the city's criminal underbelly was torn open. The fighting was violent with casualties on both sides, but hidden from the sight of the populace until, at the end of the mourning period, Justice displayed the bodies of those who had fought against his new rule, and failed. He became impossible to catch. His criminal empire all hinged on him, the man with a million quirks, the one who claimed to be chosen by destiny to bring peace to this world. Single-handedly he upturned the workings of the criminal underworld. Some worshipped him, as a messiah. Others tried to fight only to have their quirks taken from them, and he shoved unceremoniously back into the streets. Those foolish enough to try again were killed. Violent villains aiming to take over after the death of All Might had their quirks taken from them, and were executed unless they fled the city or claimed shelter with the League of Villains. Crime fell, the rate of quirklessness increased rapidly, and everyone knew the Hero Association was not responsible. The whole operation hinged on Justice. He left no evidence, there was no paper trail leading back to him, and it was theorized he worked a legitimate day job for daily life, All the profit of his criminal empire flowed down to his underlings. He even paid taxes, donating his portion of the profits to charities. He had a brainwashing quirk, meaning any employee of his caught by heroes would, and did claim they were being brainwashed. Those that were sentenced never stayed in their cells for long before being teleported away. It was hard to think of yourself as being his minion, Shinchu Karakuri thought, as she stepped through the gates of Castle Justice. Lord Justice was a king among supervillains, the greatest hero of the downtrodden and abandoned. He took in those who the system left behind, vigilantes disqualified from the Hero Association, those who dreamed of being heroes and didn't make the cut, villains forced into it by circumstance, villains looking for redemption or revenge, kids off the street who needed the dough or the training. There was no one left behind. The inventor admired the castle's facade as she walked through its halls. Like nearly everything Lord Justice did, it was not technically illegal. It was exploiting a legal loophole. Technically, the building had been legally constructed to both the standards of legal housing and a large aircraft. And if the Hero Association was going to pass a law banning it, they would need to justify why it was illegal in the first place. Lord Justice was such a popular figure, arresting him without evidence would start a civil war. So Lord Justice had a flying fortress, appearing entirely unarmed, staffed by supervillains you couldn't prove had done anything illegal. Heroes had stopped by to try and find something that would justify an arrest, asked if they had a warrant, and were politely asked to leave. The castle that hovered above the city had become a far more reassuring symbol to the public than the towers of the Hero Association. Reoccurring atrocities by the man covered in hands drove the people in droves to seek the protection of the agents of justice. Lord Justice had said in his speech to these people that they were real heroes of this age, and it was hard not to see. To be standing here, Shinchu had passed the test. Agents of justice, Lord Justice's recognized forces, followed the unwritten laws they called the natural law. They were the new code of conduct for those calling themselves villains. The rules they followed or had their quirks taken from them. The truly scary thing was how effective they were. Maximum profit, minimum risk, and PR so solid you'd be treated like a hero wherever you went. It was the new chivalry. You obeyed it or you were removed from justice's protection. The agents of justice had no room for those who couldn't follow rules. They would hang their unconscious bodies from public streets with a list of their crimes stapled to their chest, and doesn't play well with others painted above their heads. Villains were not the only ones these rules applied to. Being a hero was no longer a protection. Shinchu remembered the court case for Flame Hero Endeavor. He had tried to fight justice, and lost. His body had been the first to hang in the main square with packets of evidence of domestic abuse attached to the front of his costume. The accusations had been too public to cover up. There were riots in the street, as those who demanded a fair trial clashed with those who had been saved by him. In the end, he had not received jail time but, quirkless, and in the face of scandal, he had been forced into retirement. It was only the first of the hero trials. Under attack from two directions, the Hero Association was crumbling, and everyone knew it. Shinchu wondered which of Justice's loyal lieutenants she would be meeting today for her induction. The Knights of Justice were far more public figures than Justice himself. His sub-bosses tasked with taking care of individual territories and important duties, as varied as the Knights themselves. The Executioner Knight was a former hero killer whose mere continued presence was a sword pointed at the Hero Association, whereas the Copycat Knight, a former classmate of Justice, was obviously planning to take over for himself. Who she would be working under depended on what Justice thought of her talents. She's sure the rumors that Justice invited applicants to harvest their powerful quirks are just lies and slander. She just hoped Shed performed well enough to be allowed to work with Immutabilium. Even if it was no longer a black market good, everyone knew that Justice was really the one with the quirk to produce the rare and incredibly useful metal. She'd have a better chance of using it in construction here than anywhere else in the world. She takes a deep breath, steeling herself to look professional, and replacing her optimistic grin with a look of determination as she opens the doors. There is, thankfully, no knight waiting in the room beyond, but a plain-looking guy not much older than her, and a tall older man with 6 arms. Both are wearing the dark pinstriped suits that were standard uniform for an agent of justice. You would be Shinchu Karakuri, yes? He asks, holding a set of pins in his mouth. Here for your fitting? Fitting? Yes, right. The gadgeteer stutters, realizing now what this meeting would have been about. She's not applied for, or qualified for, active service right now, so she would be fitted for a uniform, of course. The black pinstriped suit was a defining mark of an agent. She sits on the three-legged stool and waits still as the plain-looking guy takes her measurements. Nervous? He asks her. Shinchu smiles weakly. Just a bit. My quirk is good, but I'm not sure there's anything I can do. The guy smiles reassuringly at her and offers a hand. Hey, trust in justice, he says firmly with a sweet smile. Right. She grabs his hand for a moment and finds herself smiling too. This was an organization where anyone could do something to improve the world. Weaver here didn't think there was anything he could do either, right? He asks the tailor, who is already threading a needle. He nods. His mother was a villain, and his father was a hero, the plain guy tells her. Weaver snorts. Or so she says. He says around a mouthful of pins. My mother had poison, super strong webbing, wall climbing, and a sense that let her detect danger. My father had a super tough shell. What did I inherit? Weaving. My quirk lets me understand the structure of textiles. Not much use for a hero. He lays a swatch of dark cloth over Shinka's arm. Until justice found me. This is what we're going to be using for your uniform. Shinshu runs her fingers across the cloth. Her quirk sparks on the metal hidden in the weave. This is immutabilium weave, she gasps. Weaver grins. Turns out even my useless quirk can be used to help others. He strokes the cloth. An immutabilium wire is like a thread. I can weave it into cloth, as strong as armor, but as light as cotton. There's something everyone can do. You're an inventor, right? The plain-looking guy asks. Yeah, my quirk lets me infuse my energy into machines to bring them to life, Shinshu tells him. It's a good quirk, I know, but I only use it for messing around. Don't knock the mad science, the plain boy tells her, as he raises her arm. If you can create, you can bring good into this world. Weaver's deft fingers work to sew the suit into place. We'll be glad to have you in the research department, Weaver tells her. An inventor is always welcome here. Shinshu smiles and stands in the direction of the tailor. The dark suit clings flatteringly to her body. Through her quirk she can feel the immutabilium in the weave. Looking sharp, the tailor tells her, and the plain-looking guy comes forward with a small wooden box. Finishing touches. He opens the box. Nestled inside is a shining silver signet ring with the emblem of the castle on it. Welcome to the Agents of Justice, the two say in tandem, and Shinshu feels tears well in her eyes as she picks up her ring and puts it on. As well as being proof of membership, the ring is a communications device. The plain-looking boy adds, I'll summon you when you're needed. He grins nervously. Please don't lose it. You won't get a replacement. Right. Shinshu tightens her fist, admiring the way the metal gleams. Her quirk is telling her there are all kinds of devices under the metal skin. She would have to spend some time later figuring out everything the ring could do. The two bow politely and direct her out a different door to the one she came in. Feeling a lot more official now she's in the same uniform as everyone else, Shinshu thanks the two and politely bows back before turning back to the unfamiliar room. At first she mistakes it for a corridor lined with columns as she walks forwards until she sees a small room at the end of the corridor. It contains one seat facing towards her, and it is occupied. The figure dressed in the bold colors of a hero has no face, just a blur of hazy air hovering around their neck. Their skin is probably pale, their hair probably black, but their quirk blurs anything that could be used to identify them. They smile, and their teeth show clear through the haze of their quirk. One is missing. This is a quirk she knows by reputation, Lord Justice's censor, Shinshu Karakuri. His voice is mechanical, shifting in pitch so he can't be identified. Welcome. Shinshu feels a deer in the headlights. Her body is paralyzed, and mind blank. This was the real Justice. A villain not much older than her that could swat her across the room without as much as twitching a finger. The ruler of the criminal underworld. The man with a million quirks. The strongest among heroes and villains. He stands, and Shinka's legs crumple out of all. No need to kneel, he tells her. You're here to take the oath of loyalty. He points to the ring shining on her finger. That ring is a symbol of loyalty, not to me, but to the ideals this organization represents. He crouches next to her. By joining us you are pledging your strength to correcting the injustices of the world. You do not have to do that by fighting on the front lines. If you wish to, you have permission to join the Hero Association to work to correct this system from the inside out. If you chose to stay you are agreeing to abide by my rules or your quirk is forfeit. Shinshu nods, unable to speak. She feels like her tongue has swollen to fill her entire mouth. Repeat after me, Justice says. The new agent is sworn and then permitted to leave. Lord Justice sits back on his throne. In a room down the hall, Midoriya Izuku puts away scraps of cloth and idly toys with the quirk of his new recruit. Multiplying body was one of more interesting quirks he had taken. Provided he had eaten enough, he could split a new body off using mitosis. He kept a clone here, as a decoy to draw out any attacks against him while he pretended to be one of his own minions. If they had been a hero, Shinchu would have taken the opportunity to attack, and been taken care of. Each clone only had the quirks he gave them, Sensor, and some powerful attack quirks made for a solid decoy, and on the off chance they were killed, their quirks were returned to him. They all had the mind of the original, so he could trust them with his business while he worked on more important things. His position of power was still precarious. He was relying on his older allies to help him navigate the world of criminals. He had to show proper respect for their opinions while asserting his own authority, and gathering enough forces to make lasting changes. People rallied around him, and it was his duty to protect them all. The spark of life quirk his newest agent possessed was an interesting one. It allowed a spark of force to animate an artificial body, even one as simple as a doll. If she had the temperament for hero work, he would have made an excellent frontline agent. Izuku smiles wryly. No doubt she had been told that her whole life, her passion was elsewhere. He had been the first to tell her that her inventions could do as much good as if she were forced to train as a hero. More so, the benefit a good invention had over a good quirk was that an invention could be mass-produced. He looked forward to seeing what she would produce in the future. The ring that he gave her to her was genuinely the symbol of his organization, but that wasn't all. It was made with pure immutabilium he generated. The quirk actually turned his saliva into the metal, so he spent a few hours dribbling into a bucket whenever he needed a fresh supply, and, as such, hadn't been touched by anyone other than him when it was handed to a candidate. Another quirk of his let him track anyone, but him the ring had touched, letting him teleport to any agent who had been captured. He let them think the tracking was in the ring itself, but, as soon as they put it on, he would know wherever they were at any time. If the time came, he would take that quirk for his own. He rather enjoyed being the new symbol of peace. Sure, those heroes who refused to acknowledge him referred to them as a mafia, but he was always very precise. Everyone got exactly what he deserved, and the Hero Association was crumbling anyway. Agents trained by him had infiltrated the ranks, and taught his rules to their students. In frustration about being unable to touch him, several heroes had become vigilantes, further corroding their public image. Kaken was barely controllable. He spoke out against the government's lack of action, and it made things worse. He had become a splendid rival, but the most he could do was hold things together. The Hero Association was struggling to maintain the appearance of being in control. Soon the people themselves would demand he be allowed to rule them. There was a wonderful thrill to it. Between himself and Tamura, they were tearing the fabric of society. The people could no longer allow themselves to be apathetic. They had to choose who to back, a failing government of ineffectual heroes or the one who could actually give them peace and stability. He flickers through several quirks on habit, making sure he isn't being watched, that his mind can't be read, that there's nothing nearby that can cause him trouble, that he can teleport. In the city right now, things were working according to plan. Heroes called to disaster areas found his agents had already been there. His schemes bubbled away, creating money, and those that tried to disturb this state of affairs were arrested or executed. He wonders if his sensei is watching. He hopes he is proud of them. He was making a real difference in this world. He feels like a real hero. The end. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.